Okay, good to go.
All right. I'd like to welcome everyone today on behalf of Anti-Imperialists for Global Justice to the third in our series of annual conferences inspired by the life and work of Walter Rodney. Anti-Imperialists for Global Justice is a small network of internationalists working against neocolonialism, state violence, corruption, gender depression.
Okay, good to go.
Oh. Sorry for that. Debt extractivism and ecocide with a view to the total liberation of the working people of Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Americas. It is informed by the revolutionary Marxist Pan-Africanism and internationalist praxis of Walter Rodney. From this starting point, we have begun an international dialogue on Rodney's methods and teachings, praxis, and his theoretical and historical work, and his practical revolutionary engagement, which was informed by his scholarship. Through this, we hope to build links with and participate in current struggles against the system of capitalism and imperialism. The theme of this year's event follows on from our previous conferences, which focused on Pan-Africanism, Marxism and the Next Generation. That's the first event we held in 2019, and imperialism and its neocolonial violence, which is the event that we held last year. Today, we'll be focusing more specifically on Walter Rodney and working people's history. From his PhD thesis on the history of the Upper Guinea coast, 1545 to 1800, which was later published by Oxford University Press in 1970, through How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, and his history of the Guyanese working people, 1881 to 1905, Rodney's historical scholarship displays a deep concern with working people's history, exploring themes from the impact of slavery and colonization on these working people to the extractivism that continues under neocolonial regimes today. Rodney's revolutionary approach to finding and recovering people's history from the colonial archive continues to inspire scholars and activists, and has given rise to new histories from below, histories that we hope to celebrate with this conference today. Rodney's status as a radical people's historian is indisputable, but academia has long been averse to accepting Rodney among the ranks of its professional historians. Of the historical books that Rodney published in his lifetime, 2 were written in the traditional style of historical scholarship, and only How Europe Underdeveloped Afrika was written in a more accessible style that moved away from the conventions of historical scholarship. So it's kind of surprising always to see how little he does come up amongst those kind of traditional historians. But the content of his work and approach remain the same throughout all the historical works. But even today, Walter does not get the recognition that he truly deserves for his studies of working people's history from Guyana to Jamaica and Continental Afrika. Histories written from below and with the aim of the liberation of working people from imperialism, neocolonialism, and state violence. In one of his other major works, The Groundings with My Brothers, a collection of public lectures held in Jamaica and at the Congress of Black Writers in Montreal, Rodney offered a pedagogical framework for intellectuals fighting to undo the epistemological distortions of imperialism. But for him, grounding was more than just a method of teaching, learning, or knowledge production. It was a way of life. To truly ground, Rodney believed, the revolutionary intellectual must be able to go anywhere to reason with their people. This, of course, included going to places that many academics of Rodney's stature would not have set foot in. So this is a quote from Rodney from The Groundings with My Brothers. I was prepared to go anywhere that a group of Black people were prepared to sit down and listen. It might be in a sports club, it might be in a schoolroom, it might be in a church, it might be in a gully. Dark, dismal places with a Black population who have had to seek refuge there. You will have to go there if you want to talk to them. Today, we celebrate Walter Rodney's legacy as a revolutionary historian and scholar activist. The strength of his legacy lies in his exceptionally rich class, race, and gender-based praxis, informed by Marxist political economy, as well as his passionate commitment to African culture. 41 years after his death, Rodney remains one of the foremost revolutionary Pan-Africanists of the 20th century. As we all know, Walter's life was dramatically cut short at the age of 38, when a bomb hidden in a walkie-talkie detonated in the car that he and his brother were in. At the time, Walter's brother Donald was charged with the possession of explosives, and Walter's true killer received asylum and assumed a new identity. The independent commission of inquiry that was set up after his death to investigate the circumstances of Walter's death conclusively showed that it was not a random act of violence or an accident, as the Guyanese government had claimed at the time, but an extrajudicial killing, sanctioned and orchestrated by the state. In April this year, the Court of Appeal finally overturned Donald Rodney's conviction, And on June 10th, Attorney General Anil Nandal announced that Rodney's death certificate would be amended to acknowledge that his cause of death was not misadventure, as it was previously claimed, but assassination. It was also decided that Rodney would feature more prominently in the national curriculum, that his works be made available in the University of Guyana Library, and that the Walter Rodney Chair be re-established at the university. This welcome correction of a massive miscarriage of justice has been made possible by the hard work of campaigning of Dr. Patricia Rodney, Donald Rodney, and all the activists who have been fighting for justice since June 13th of 1980. As we commemorate the 41st anniversary of Rodney's death, we must remember that the struggle cannot stop here. Historical wrongs of this scale cannot ever really be made right. But through our efforts to continue Walter's political and historical work, we can celebrate his life and legacy and contribute to his emancipatory project. So just to run you through the panels quickly that we'll have today. The first presentation of today will be given by Chantal George from the University of Glasgow, who will be discussing the problems with reading Walter Rodney at SOAS, Walter's alma mater, and also my own. I did my undergraduate there. Here we'll get to explore Walter's complicated relationship with the bourgeois academic institution and how this institution has tried to manage his challenging revolutionary output, as well as how or if SOAS has embraced or received his work. The second panel of the day will focus on Walter in the context of Continental Africa, with Chineda Chukudinma talking to us about Rodney's analysis of class formation, class contradictions, and resistance to imperialism in Tanzania and East Africa, and Hamza Haji, who was also part of the first conference that we had in 2019, speaking to us about the colonial epistemology of education and its impact on African youth today. The final panel will explore Walter's contributions to the historiography of Guyana and his role as a revolutionary historian, with a set of talks from Kimani Nehusi from Temple University, Wazi Mohammed, a former colleague of Walter's in the WPA, and Cecil Gottsmore, who will be speaking to us about how Rodney's historical work pushed back against the imperialist divide and rule strategies, which sought to sow the seeds of division among Guyana's multi-ethnic working classes. So just a brief note before we get started. The event is being live streamed on YouTube and a recording will be made available as soon as possible. If you have any questions for the panelists, please place them in the comments section of the YouTube stream. Amanda, who's co-hosting with me today, and I will pass them on to the panelists at the end of each panel. We've also allocated some time for discussion among the panelists, so if you have any questions or comments for your fellow panelists, please do not hesitate to ask them. We'll just be doing that after all the viewer comments and questions, after we've gone through those. So I'd like to thank everyone again for joining us today to celebrate the life and work of Walter Rodney. This event is of course dedicated to him, but we'd also like to dedicate today's event to Comrade Aziz Chowdhury, who's recently passed away and who will be sorely missed. Amanda will be saying a few words in honor of Aziz at the end of the event. So I think we can get started now with the first talk of the day, and that, as I've already said, will be Chantal George. Just a brief introduction. Chantal is a historian of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery, with particular focus on the British Caribbean. She's currently a lecturer in transatlantic slavery at the University of Glasgow. Thank you for being with us here today, Chantal.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to Amanda and Cecil in particular. I'm excited to share the influence that Walter Rodney has had on my scholarship and my teaching, and also reflect on the experience of being a student at SOAS and being exposed to his ideas. So I hope you all can see my screen. Let me know if you can't. In March 2021, Adam Habib, SOAS's newly appointed director, was suspended following the use of the N-word in an online forum. In an attempt to defend himself, Habib, a South African of Asian heritage, stated context matters. Responding to Habib, a student evoked the work of Walter Rodney, the SOAS alumni, who gained his PhD at the mere age of 24. The student stated, our own alumni, Walter Rodney, has written why people, non-Black POC and white bodies shouldn't use the N-word. A petition calling for Habib's dismissal stated that the incident was emblematic of the experiences that Black students go through at SOAS and the institution's historical failure to deal with them. For us as a Black student body, the petition continued, we shall not accept leadership from a director who is racist and does not understand the African condition, African history, and why there are Black Africans in the diaspora. Even under the leadership of the previous director, the Guyanese-born Baroness Valerie Amos, student felt shortchanged. Amos's neoliberal agenda was evidenced by his support of the Iraq War as a Labour politician, but also circumstances within SOAS. There's a lot to be said here, but I think what's really impactful or iconic to me is the disillusion of several courses, including the foundational BA in African Studies under her watch, which has been replaced by a sort of generic program called the BA in Languages and Cultures. And one must remember that SOAS problematically stands for the School of Oriental and African Studies. And by slashing this key course, we might wonder where the African in SOAS is. So returning to Habib, an external investigation was conducted, and it was found out that whilst he was wrong to use the N-word, it did not make him a racist. So Habib resumed his role in May 2021, and several recommendations were put forward to address the pain and distress it caused, including a clear policy or formulating a clear policy on the use of the N-word in the SOAS community. I want to suggest that this incident reveals something about the climate at SOAS, its anti-Blackness, but also illustrates the important contribution of one of SOAS's former Black students. By evoking Rodney, this case speaks to the enduring intellectual and political inspiration on students from multiple disciplines, history, politics, development, especially students of African heritage, who often draw from the life and work of Rodney, who completed his PhD at SOAS 55 years later. And also to mention, there's a Walter Rodney Prize fund, which recognizes student excellence for the work on the history of Africa and the African diaspora. And this was not set up by SOAS, it was set up by his widow in memory of him in 2019, Patricia Rodney. And there's also a poster at SOAS, one of their influential alumni that sort of litters the staircase as you go up. And it's a recent addition. I do not remember seeing it, or it was not in existence when I was a student 14 years ago, and when I was a PhD student 6 or 7 years ago. So I'll add a caveat here that I was undergraduate at SOAS from 2004 to 2007. So my work kind of the presentation speaks to these years, my experiences, and also 2011, 2017, where I did my PhD and taught a course on transatlantic slavery. So my personal experience in this case is drawn from these years. So I will draw on this experience, excerpts from Walter Rodney Speaks, and also the historiography on Western Africa and the Atlantic slave trade to consider the ways in which Rodney's historical work and legacy is remembered in the institution. So on arrival at SOAS, in his own words, Walter Rodney talks about his experiences in Walter Rodney Speaks. He had an open scholarship to attend SOAS following his first class degree in history at UWI Mona. His academic qualifications were belittled. He writes, "The question was raised as to whether or not I had to take some qualifying exams or to do some papers in their undergraduate work, since he had come from the colonies." And he recognized that SOAS was this institution set up to train colonial administrators in administering the British Empire. He describes the African history section, or maybe African section as it was in SOAS back in the day, as involved in the defense of bourgeoisie ideology. And he found his supervisor, Richard Gray, he calls him a liberal bourgeoisie historian, but sympathetic and helpful. Now, no surprise, Rodney was highly critical of this academic community, but from Walter Rodney Speaks, he makes it clear that he felt that he didn't want to leave the scholarship in the hands of the enemy. His quote there, "in the hands of the enemy." and that some material was loaded and ideologically very hostile, but it was an important mental exercise in mastering the tools of the discipline of history. So Rodney maintained contact with his supervisor, Gray, and especially when Rodney was in Tanzania, Rodney contributed essays to the Cambridge History of Africa, 1600 to 1790, edited by Gray. Gray also wrote Rodney's obituary in 1918 in the London Times, describing him as one of the most significant third world historians of his generation. So, as Kevin said, how Europe Undeveloped Africa aimed to circumvent some of the academic conventions, especially he did not use footnotes, which is a convention within history. And this was for accessibility, aimed to operate outside the institution to reach his own people. And the history of the Upper Guinea Coast was based on his PhD, and it aimed to put slavery in the context of capitalism and examine the impact of external forces especially from namely the Portuguese across the Atlantic, but also the ruling elites of the interior. So I will draw on these two works, as well as a couple of other articles that Rodney wrote, to talk about his key ideas, but also how it was critiqued and supported by historians thereafter. So how was Walter Rodney's work remembered and treated within history classes? So I'll go over this by looking at the historiography. So Walter Rodney argued that African societies were developing independently until overtaken by Europeans, and Europeans underdeveloped Africa, creating this relationship of dependency. The Atlantic slave trade was an unequal partnership between ruling elites and Europeans and the masses of people suffering. He also commented on, he would say, so-called slavery, defining these systems of dependency within Africa as being very different to chattel slavery. And I could say more about that, but I'm going to condense some of the material because I know time is limited. In terms of the economic impact of the transatlantic slavery, he talked about the goods, the cheap, rubbish goods that strangled African industries. The importance of warfare on economics, agriculture, the gun slave cycle, which is put forward by other historians such as Inokori, which talks about the importance of the importation of guns and the social violence, political legacies of this. He also mentioned large states such as Dahomey and Ashanti, which grew powerful because of European guns, and also the attempts by some African leaders to curb the slave trade. He mentions the demographic loss, the loss of inventiveness, the development opportunity. And so the context of Walter Rodney's work is definitely located in this dependency theory and is anti-capitalist. So we're introduced to Rodney's foundational ideas within the history classes, but often his work was dismissed in favor of other historians. I'll introduce one such as, quite a few actually, the Atlanticist Americanist David Eltis in his book, his 1987 book. He argued that the transatlantic slave trade didn't affect African societies much. And it had a weak influence on African economies. Controversially, he argued that the imported American foodstuffs, such as maize and cassava, revolutionized agriculture in Western Africa and actually helped population growth. So he argues that any demographic impact was offset by population growth due to the high calorific intake of these American crops. We can see immediately the hostile environment, intellectually hostile environment that is produced at SOAS. In another essay, 1988, Eltis teamed up with the historian, I believe, Jennings, to say this, not only to minimize the impact of the slave trade, but that the majority of Africans would have been about as well off and would have been performing the same tasks in the same socio-economic environment had there been no slave trade. J.D. Fage, another historian who taught at SOAS, explicitly challenged Rodney's ideas in 1975 He argued for the existence of forms of dependency, unfreedom, slavery before the Atlantic slave trade, and that Europeans simply tapped into this existing form of slavery, in order to supply captives for the Americas. Fage states that Rodney represented the Black peoples of the Atlantic slave trade and slavery, whereas Fage, stem from the race and culture that did the exploitation. He described Rodney as a romantic. And as a student reading Fage, it was surprising that he articulated his own positionality. And this was often missing from interpretations of the past. So myself and some of my peers felt, well, we were cognizant of the historians that we read, who were overwhelmingly white and male, and came to the study of history with their own biases. And it's particularly clear from Altus's work. And Fage's work. So Fage minimizes the impact of the slave trade and offensively summarizing, even, he says, in the worst areas, the effect of the slave exports may have been no more than to cream off surplus population. And obviously this is a very hostile claim. There have been several historians since Walter Rodney, such as Inakuri, who famously wrote the prominent book, Africans, the Industrial Revolution in England. And he talks about the importance of the gun slave cycle, as it's called, the thirst for weapons, the thirst for enslaved peoples, and the number of guns that were imported to Africa, especially in the 18th century. And that slavery, and that the issue of slavery and domestic slavery, he stresses that the issue is not whether it existed before the Atlantic slave trade, but what the Atlantic slave trade did to the extent and character of slavery in the region. So the debate over the impact of the Atlantic slave trade has continued into the 90s and 2000s. And you have a book by John Thornton called Africans and Africans in the Making of the Atlantic World. As you can tell from the title suggests that African elites played a critical role in the development of the slave trade. It argues several things. Just to point out a few, that there were short-term benefits for African elites, such as political expansion, whereas Rodney emphasizes, maybe similar in some sense, that African rulers in West Africa, and this is from his 1967 article, and if you want the name, I have it, were in full political control during the period of the Atlantic slave trade. But crucially, Rodney argues that this was detrimental to the African peoples. And this is something that Thornton doesn't generally stress. And on the issue of slavery, Rodney's argument is that forms of dependency within Africa was expanded as a result of the slave trade. Whereas Thornton argues that forms of dependency were already widespread in Africa, and that the slave trade was just an outgrowth of internal slavery. Controversially, he says, internal slavery was thus as much as responsible as any external force for the development of the Atlantic slave trade. Placing the responsibility on African societies. And Rodney warns that describing Africa's role in the slave trade as major is an attempt to excuse Europeans by placing blame and responsibility on Africans, and discusses the global power that Europeans had, and acknowledging at the same time that African leaders collaborated with Europeans, drawing parallels with present-day African leaders in the neo-colonial environment. Another historian is Patrick Manning, and briefly, he focuses on the human loss that Walter Rodney focused on, and noted that in 1850, around the end of the Atlantic slave trade in Africa, Africa's population was half of what it would have been in the absence of the slave trade. So he stresses the acute demographic impact on African societies as a result of warfare, political instability, etc. And one historian that was very influential to me and how I thought about African history and the slave trade was Bibacar Barry. His 1998 book looks at Senegambia and the unity, so that would include Senegal, Gambia, and Guinea. And he looks at the impact of the Atlantic slave trade, the importation of guns, the clash between traditional African rulers and Muslim authorities, the consolidation as well as breakup of states, and the economic stagnation, the chronic violence, the loss in productive labor in his regional case study. He acknowledges Rodney as a late friend and his groundbreaking work in the region. He looks at this history and how it contributed to the current underdevelopment and dependence of Senegambia. So another historian is David Warthrop in 2002, who talked about the limited economic development in Africa that occurred during the transatlantic slave trade. So limited economic development. And he says, in some cases, imported cloth damaged indigenous textile industry, and in other areas, there was an expanded market able to absorb both local imported cloth. But the issue of technology is stressed by Northrop, and he says, there was little or no technological transfer between Europe and Africa. Indeed, it wouldn't have been in Europe's best interest for there to be, example, gun manufacturing industries in Western Africa. Linda Hayward, who's famously written a book on Nzinga recently, in her work, she stresses the importance of Congo's ties to Western Europe and how until the 18th century, Congo was protected those who were born in the kingdom from slavery, even going as far as sending peoples or representatives to Brazil and bringing back those who were falsely enslaved. So it's a really interesting case study looking at how the Kingdom of Congo, although it was involved in the transatlantic slave trade with Europeans, also attempted to curb that slave trade and put an end to it too. Another historian is Okaji, who talks about the widespread forms of dependency within Africa described by Lado Equiano. And I think what's so interesting about Nkoji's work is the focus or acknowledging that slavery is a global and ancient institution, and its existence in Africa cannot satisfactorily explain why the continent supplied captives to Europeans. And he agrees with Rodney about how the local and religious power in Igbo land were manipulated by the ruling elite for profit. Finally, the historian Paul Lovejoy, he's informed by Walter Rodney's thesis, and he argues against the minimal impact of the transatlantic slave trade. His transformation thesis holds that the Atlantic slave trade marked a radical break in the history of Africa, which resulted in forms of dependency and greater exploitation of labor within African societies. And he mentions population decline, social dislocation, loss of life from enslavement, and subsequent famine and disease, and concludes that there's a causal relationship between the transatlantic slave trade and Africans' underdevelopment. So to conclude, Walter Rodney's work in the 1960s and 70s was foundational for many reasons. In terms of the treatment of the Atlantic slave trade and its effects on African societies, it ushered in a multitude of works, some of which aim to critique Rodney's work. For students of African descent, Rodney's work was particularly impactful. As mentioned, SOAS was part of Britain's imperialist project. It was built to skill elite such as Enoch Powell, who studied Urdu with the aim of becoming the Viceroy of India. And that wasn't realized, and we know about Enoch Powell and his legacy in Britain. So this environment at SOAS was intellectually hostile, as Walter Rodney describes, whether you're in economics, politics, development studies, or history. African writers are often dismissed or not recognized, not even on the curriculum sometimes, and in favor of mainly white men. This is changing because of the efforts to decolonize the curriculum and projects such as Why is my professor white? Why is my curriculum white? So this speaks to my time at SOAS as an undergraduate some 14 years ago. That's why it was invigorating and affirming to take classes in the BA in African Studies program, which is now dissolved. African descended students experience microaggression and racism. And within this colonial neoliberal environment, you're often one of the few Black students in the class with usually a white professor. So this is the context. And I remember one professor mentioned when I taught at SOAS that Black students are just too emotional when it comes to slavery. So Walter Rodney's contribution reiterating this. So we often heard terms like phrases such as Africans sold other Africans. And Walter Rodney his work pushed me to consider African elites and the African masses, right? Identifying who these Africans were. And you often hear terms, phrases such as, what did Africans get for slavery? And Walter Rodney's work encouraged me to think about greed and European capitalism and the loss of human life. At SOAS, we're often introduced to texts that would class enslaved peoples as slaves and commodities, and how they were cheap and seen as necessary for the development of American plantations. And Walter Rodney's work got us to think about European capitalism. And in terms of this idea or the argument that slavery existed with Africa, Walter Rodney's work talked about these forms of independencies that were exacerbated with European demand for slavery and was very different from chattel slavery. And often the impact of the slave trade, as I mentioned before, was minimized. And you have all these economic analysis by these economic historians mostly, and Walter Rodney's work got me to think about how the cost is often immeasurable and unquantifiable, this social violence and the loss of life. So to conclude, or in summary, Rodney gifted many students with the language in which to express our histories in light of the violence reproduced in the classroom, the colonial archives, and secondary reading materials. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chantal, for that really, really great presentation. I'm sure we'll have some space for discussion alongside that as well, because I think people are keen to ask some questions. Just due to time constraints, we'll now have to move on relatively quickly. So Chinedu is going to be talking to us about the petty bourgeoisie, the peasants and workers, Rodney's analysis of class formation, class contradictions, and resistance to imperialism in Tanzania and East Africa. Just to introduce Chinedu briefly, he's part of the Review of African Political Economy editorial working group. He's a member of the Socialist Workers' Party and an affiliate of the Review of African Political Economy. He writes on African politics, popular struggles, and the history of working class resistance on the continent. So welcome, Chinedu.
Thanks. If you went to Tanzania in the late 1960s, you would find yourself in the absolute mecca of African liberation. And I say this because Tanzania's first president, Nyerere, and his party TANU, tried to challenge imperialism better than most African leaders. They nationalized the foreign banks and the trading companies, and they allowed almost every single liberation army in Southern Africa to have a base in Tanzania. And so Rodney lives and he teaches in Tanzania from 1969 to 1974. And that's where he writes his most famous book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which is an amazing account of how Western imperialism, through the slave trade and colonialism, basically dragged Africa into poverty. And Rodney draws the conclusion that the new independent nations of Africa have to break with imperialism. Breaking with imperialism is the way out of misery, and it is the true condition for independence. And when you're talking about challenging imperialism, like Rodney did, well, you need to ask, of course, what we need to do. But more importantly, you need to ask who should lead the struggle for national liberation? Which class has to lead the fight against imperialism? And I think this is what Rodney does in his other writings and speeches in Tanzania, and even after he leaves Tanzania. And he really invites us to look at the classes in Africa that have been created by colonialism, and also how these classes enter into conflict with each other after independence. And we will see that these classes actually have very different attitudes towards the struggle for liberation in the 1970s. So I'm going to talk you through here how Rodney answers the question, which class should lead the fight against imperialism, by focusing essentially on Tanzania. And I will highlight how Rodney changes his mind on that question. Now, the first class that has the largest focus in Rodney's writings is the class that he calls the petty bourgeoisie. And the term refers to the small minority of Africans that were educated under colonialism. They also sometimes can be referred to as the intelligentsia, because they're often intellectuals, petty civil servants, army officers, and qualified professionals. All the leaders of the anti-colonial movement in the 1950s and 60s kind of belong to that class. So Nyerere of Tanzania was a teacher with a degree from Edinburgh. Idi Amin was an army man who was trained by the British. And I think Jomo Kenyatta was a civil servant at some point in his life. And this class, you see, has a tricky formation, because on the one hand, they're privileged under colonialism. They enjoy a higher standard of living than the masses of the peasants and the workers. But at the same time, they're constantly humiliated and discriminated by the colonizers, who they often have to work for in the towns and the cities. And the Ghanaian revolutionary, Amilcar Cabral, always said, look, my boss was an idiot. I could have done his job with my eyes closed. But at the end of the day, I was Black and he was Portuguese, and that's what mattered for colonialism. But because the petty bourgeoisie is more educated than the masses, they become that section of society that manages to articulate the anger of the masses against the colonial power. And so they form political movements, political parties in the 1950s, and eventually win state power from the colonizers in the 1960s and 70s. And in his first 3 years in Tanzania, Rodney sees two directions that the intelligentsia can take in relation to the struggle against imperialism. And his position is very similar to that of Cabral and Frantz Fanon in that respect. Because on the one hand, he sees the petty bourgeoisie as a bunch of sellouts. It can be a greedy and arrogant class that is happy to receive crumbs from the imperialist power after independence, especially. And you can put people like, I don't know, Kenya's first president, Jomo Kenyatta, and his government in that category, because Kenya is a classic case of neocolonialism. After independence, Kenyatta does nothing at all to challenge the foreign multinationals. Instead, he gives some land that belonged to the white settlers and some companies that belong to the Asians to members of his own class, African, mainly Kikuyu, who become the new middlemen under imperialism. But on the other hand, Rodney thinks that the petty bourgeoisie can be revolutionary, that it can even play a leading revolutionary role in the struggle. And it can play that leading revolutionary role if it seeks to identify and align itself with the interests of the masses. And Rodney looks to the progressive leadership of people like Samora Machel of Mozambique, who's leading a guerrilla struggle against the Portuguese. But he especially looks at what Nyerere is doing in Tanzania. And in 1972, Rodney writes an important article called Ujama and Scientific Socialism. Ujama means the extended family, and it's a word that is often used as a synonym for Tanzanian socialism. And in his article, if you like, Rodney defends the Tanzanian state as the drivers for socialist transformation. And what Rodney first believed here was that in an underdeveloped country like Tanzania, the working class was too small and perhaps too young to play the same revolutionary role as it did in Europe or in Russia, for instance. And he thinks that socialism should be based on the peasantry, because the peasantry are the poorest and the largest class in Africa. And that's what he thinks Nyerere and TANU and the intellectuals around the party are actually trying to do. Because under Ujama, the Tanzanian state was trying to move peasants from isolated homesteads into collective farms. And these collective farms would be supplied with water, electricity, and new collective farming techniques. And the goal of this program was for Tanzania to achieve self-reliance in food and eradicate poverty from the countryside. Like that, Tanzania wouldn't have to depend on the West for food imports. And it was also believed that collective farming would stop Tanzania from becoming like Kenya, where cash crop farming, capitalist farming, actually produced a handful of rich farmers at the expense of thousands of landless peasants. And so that's why Rodney sees Ujama as a real revolutionary step. And he sincerely believes that the Tanzanian state represents an alliance between the peasants, the workers, and the revolutionary petty bourgeoisie around TANU. But Rodney changes his position on Tanzanian socialism quite quickly when he realizes the failures of Nyerere's Ujama's policies. And this becomes clear in a speech that he makes in 1975, only 4 months after he left Tanzania. And the speech is called Class Contradictions in Tanzania, which becomes actually published as a writing. And Rodney explains there that when food shortages hit the Tanzanian countryside in 1973, the Tanzanian state tried to build in a hurry new collective farms. But this time they didn't seek to convince the peasants to move into these farms. They actually forced the peasants to move into them. So all this talk about intellectuals having to do away with their elitism, align themselves with the masses, trying to convince the peasants peacefully, all this talk here flew out the window. And when the peasants refused to move, says Rodney, well, the state actually deployed the police. And Rodney is somebody who in Tanzania goes to the countryside and he talks to the peasants, and he learns from his discussions with the peasants that they had no control whatsoever in terms of production. They couldn't decide what to produce and when to produce. And actually they led a daily resistance against Ujama that he kind of documents. And in truth, what was happening is that the whole life of the Tanzanian peasant was, if you want, in control of these petty bourgeois bureaucrats who saw themselves as superior to the peasants because they were educated. And all that mattered for this petty bourgeois bureaucracy was how much grain and how much surplus they could quickly extract from the peasants in order to feed the nation and also compete on the international market. So there was a real conflict developing between the peasantry and the petty bourgeoisie that Rodney writes about. And even if we move away from the countryside to the towns and the cities in Tanzania, Rodney is really disappointed that the nationalization of foreign companies fails to give any control to the workers. And these observations force Rodney to refine his understanding of the petty bourgeoisie, and he becomes more and more disillusioned with that class. Because far from sharing power with the peasants and the workers, Rodney argues that the petty bourgeoisie is keen to maintain its dominance over the states because it's a privileged class. It's a privileged class that relies extremely on the state for power and accumulation. That's what Rodney writes. And what you have to understand here for Rodney is that the petty bourgeoisie in Tanzania is a class that never historically owned anything. It never had any capital, it never had any factories because colonialism did not allow it to do so. So after independence, if you like, the state becomes everything for the petty bourgeoisie. It becomes a real bureaucratic formation. And the nationalization of foreign companies, Rodney says, gives the petty bourgeoisie the opportunity to grab comfortable managerial jobs within the state, have a decent salary, maybe travel to Europe, but especially get your friends and families in. And this is why Rodney says that the petty bourgeoisie is a class that is constantly seeking to reproduce itself. It does not care about sacrificing its privileges. Rather, it wants to be in a position where it can exploit the peasants and the workers. And as Rodney becomes more and more pessimistic about the Tanzanian petty bourgeoisie, he starts to reconsider his earlier stance on the Tanzanian working class. And he says it like this: maybe the workers have a much larger part to play in the Tanzanian liberation. They might be small in number, but they're actually situated in centers of production that are actually vital for the Tanzanian economy, such as the rubber factories, the docks, and the hospitals, and you can name it. And so what Rodney does here is that he looks back at the workers' revolts against the Tanzanian bureaucracy in the new national factories of Tanzania in the early 1970s. And he sees that in the early 1970s, the Tanzanian state issued a charter for workers' rights. And this was a charter to show that the Tanzanian petty bourgeois management would be better factory managers than the colonizers, that they would respect the workers more somehow. And all of this was nonsense, says Rodney. And Rodney rejoices at the fact that the workers took the charter and actually agitated to ensure that their rights were implemented in the workplace. And their agitation actually surprised the management, because some of the workers used to wear the charter around their necks. And they used to go up to the management and tell the managers, look, you haven't given us better wages. You haven't given us better working conditions. You haven't stopped harassment in the workplace. And when, I think I have more than 2 minutes. And when the managers said, no, we're not going to give you any higher wages, we're not going to give you better working conditions, well, the workers led a series of strikes and occupations. And what these working class struggles showed Rodney is that socialism is not something that can be delivered from above by a group of enlightened leaders. Rather, socialism is something that has to be won from below by the masses in a struggle. And this is really the core of Rodney's Marxist thinking. And he describes that in one rubber factory, the workers actually kicked out the petty bourgeois management and started running the rubber factory on their own. And the workers were saying, look, we can run the factories better than the petty bourgeoisie. And in doing so, Rodney says, is that the workers were actually asking the question and answering the question of who should control production in a socialist society? Who is the real boss in this society? And Rodney says that the Tanzanian petty bourgeoisie eventually crushed these revolts because it challenged their very existence as a class. And so the workers were not just some revolutionary group among others. They actually held the key to a new democratic way of running society. Now, I have 2 conclusions before I end. The first here is that I want to say that intellectuals as individuals can make important contributions to every single revolutionary movement. And that's why we celebrate people like Walter Rodney. That's why we celebrate people like C.L.R. James and etc. But when intellectuals act as a class, as they did in Africa in the 1960s and 70s, well, then they have a tendency to rise above the masses and manipulate the masses to remain in power. And this is why Rodney becomes very disappointed with the African petty bourgeoisie, even when it appears in its progressive manifestation, like in Tanzania. And in 1978, Rodney will go as far as to say that TANU is a party of the petty bourgeoisie completely incapable of leading any socialist transformation. And he was absolutely right on that account. And all you need to do is look at how Tanzania capitulated to the IMF in the 1980s. My second conclusion concerns the workers. You see, I often hear people around me sometimes repeat Frantz Fanon's argument that somehow Marxist theory needs to be stretched or modified when we talk about African politics. And it's somehow the idea that other classes than the workers must lead the African revolution. Of course, every class has a part to play in a revolutionary situation. However, I think that Rodney's understanding of class in Africa and in Tanzania ultimately shows the opposite. It shows that the Tanzanian working class, no matter how small, has a strategic position within the capitalist system, which gives it more power than any other group. And when it engages in strikes, and when it uses its ability to stop production and bring down the system, it can propose a new collective way of running society, one that is completely different from the profit-making multinationals and different from the African petty bourgeoisie. And that's why the working class is the class that can pull behind it the radical intellectuals, the peasants, and every single oppressed group in society that has an interest in fighting imperialism and building a society that is free from exploitation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chinedu. Sorry for pushing you with the 2 minutes, but that was a really, really great presentation. I think we'll definitely have some room for discussion about your presentation as well later. And I'm sure the other panelists will have some questions as well. So next up, we have Hamza Haji, who will be speaking on Walter Rodney on the colonial epistemology of education and its impact on current African youth on the continent and abroad, language, tradition, and the brain drain. Just to introduce Hamza quickly, Hamza is a teaching fellow in the Communicating for Impact team at African Leadership University. He's a graduate of Kingston University, London, with a degree in politics and international relations. He's also got experience working as a consultant for small and medium enterprises and a support worker for university students with disabilities. He's a self-taught Pan-Africanist, a passionate African, and a strong believer that change in Africa lies in building a better education system, on a mission to decolonize the curriculum for Africans at home and abroad. So welcome, Hamza.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you to the previous speakers. My address is going to be a little bit different, so you guys can bear with me. The conclusion will make a lot more sense. I would like to start by stating that, once again, that my name is Hamza. I was born and raised in Rwanda. I grew up in a small town called Kamembe in the southwestern region of the country. The small town was known for the people who lived there. They were referred to as Baswahili, an indication that their main language of communication was Kiswahili, and most of them were predominantly Muslim. Part of my identity comes from this background, given that my father was born and raised in this town. My mother, on the other hand, is from a small town called Kibungo in the southeastern region of Rwanda, near the Tanzanian border. Born from a Tanzanian Muslim father and a Rwandan Christian mother, but her identity was predominantly influenced by Rwandan culture, to the detriment of her father's identity, which was Tanzanian. A reference to my mother's origin is simply for contextualization for the further part of this address, as I will be using my own experience as a basis for my arguments. For now, I will mainly focus on my father's cultural identity, as it is the one that influenced my person despite being raised by my mother. This is given the realities of my father's culture, which specifically dictate that children should be raised in the image of their father, especially male children. Where my father's is from, and in consequence where I'm from, the Baswahili town of Kamembe, people were heavily influenced by Arabic culture. The Baswahili consider themselves civilized as opposed to the other Rwandans. They believe that the way they speak, dress, and carry themselves is superior to that of other Rwandans. They choose to alienate themselves and often look down on their fellow countrymen and women. Growing up, my understanding was that I should only speak Kiswahili, as it is the language of the civilized Muslim, given its origin in Arabic. Kinyarwanda was considered the language of the Bushmen. My father would say, "Usizungumze ile lugha, ni ya washamba," which means to not speak that language. It's of the Bushmen. As problematic as this was, given the reality of my siblings and I growing up, we were unfortunately indoctrinated into adopting this belief. But as I became older, naturally, given the absence of my father as he worked abroad, the rebellious spirit in my siblings and I pushed us to speak Kinyarwanda when no one was around, to the point where we eventually acquired some sort of fluency in the language. As we went to school, originally attending a Rwandan public school, we were easily alienated as we were considered other. This whole idea of superiority was quickly crushed by the weight of estrangement, the shaped part of my identity. The other part was shaped by the type of education I received. As mentioned above, I initially attended a Rwandan public school. However, eventually given my father's stance on the civilized versus the Bushmen, my siblings and I were taken to a school in the nearby Congo city of Bukavu. And here began my miseducation, what Rodney refers to as being Europeanized. I was to become assimilated. I didn't know it then, but I would find out eventually. However, as instability grows in the Congo, we were forced to move from my little hometown of Kamembe to Kigali, the capital city. There I attended both a French and a Belgian school. At school, I learned about the great achievements, conquest, social, economic, and political advancements of Europe. I learned about colonization in the perspective of the colonizer, or the colonial apologist, as Rodney calls them. By the third year of my high school education, I could name all the countries in the European Union and their capital cities. I still can, funnily enough. I could tell the tale of how Europe rose from the ashes of ignorance and went on a mission to save the rest of the world, almost like I had been there myself. Conversely, I could not name a single province in the country I was born and raised in. I had no understanding of the history my country had experienced, and I could barely speak the language. I knew nothing of the Songhai Empire, Dahomey, Kush, Timbuktu, Kemet, Zulu, the great kingdom of the Congo, and the like. I truly believed, even though it was never explicitly stated in my education, that the Africans had made no contribution to history whatsoever. I was to understand this later on as an adult, as Rodney explained that colonialism determined that Africans were no inure makers of history than were beetles, objects to be looked at under a microscope. This only furthered my alienation from my countrymen and women. To further the disconnect between my cultural identity, tradition, and I went to England to study political science and international relations. Before I go on, I would like to stress that I realize my social advantage and what Brother Chinet was referring to as the petite bourgeoisie. I am a clear case study of that social class. And I would not like to be communicating that I'm not grateful for these experiences. However, the point I'm trying to make is not based on finances, rather on the way education shaped my identity. Anyways, I digress. As I was saying, I moved to England. My first surprise as I started my course was the lack of inclusion of the history of African people's positive contribution to the world, even in a course that was called International Relations. In most of the modules, Africa was painted as a continent of violence, hunger, and overall underdevelopment, except for one, which was Amanda Latimer's module, which I felt gave me the material and resources that consider the reality of not only African people, but all Black peoples, as Rodney refers to them in his other work, Groundings with My Brothers, where he emphasizes that Black peoples include all people who are subject to the ruthless oppressing fist of white imperialism. Amanda's course drew me to her. However, I was only able to form a true relationship with her as once I was in the middle of my third year and last year at university. I remember being in Amanda's office and she asked me, as we discussed the history of my country, have you read Walter Rodney? And I said no. And she showed me the book, and I will never forget that moment because that moment shaped my understanding of life as it is right now and life as an African. I read the chapters on what is development, what is underdevelopment, and education for underdevelopment. And this is where I am right now. I have a clear understanding that there is a hidden curriculum that exists within the schools right after independence. So as Rodney discusses in his book, when we made the transition from being dependent to independent, we only copied and pasted everything that was happening in the colonial system into our systems today. And this is not something that I'm saying out of the top of my head. This is something I experience every day on the continent. People do not understand their history. They believe that the closest they can become to being successful and to being purposeful and being completed is by coming closest to a European. As I said, and as Kevin introduced, I teach communicating for impact at university. One of my students came into my classroom and they said, "Sir, I don't understand the material." And I asked them, "Why don't you understand the material? Haven't you read over it multiple times?" And the student explained that the language was too advanced for them. They did not understand English. So what I proceeded to do is I explained the material in their home language. I explained the material in their mother tongue. And the student understood the material and was able to submit a work at a higher standard than they'd had done previously. And this is where it hit me. It was clear what Rodney was talking about. There has to be a complete and radical break with the capitalist system, not only in a political and economic sense, but on the cultural and traditional sense. Because as we moved closer to what we define as development, we're moving away to what defines us. I would like to end by saying that how my identity was shaped and where I am today is a clear proof of what Rodney was talking about. He talked about the fact that the colonial education was a system to perpetuate the colonial agenda and shape individuals that had no understanding of their culture and tradition. So here comes our mission. Our mission as people who've been educated is to take on the burden of clarifying these issues, clarifying the issues within the curriculum, and showing to the people, to the working masses, that this is not the truth. The truth is not to come the closest to European. The truth is not that Europe was the center of history. The truth is that we were the original source of history, and they changed history in order to fit their agenda. So I'd like to end on that note, that we must remember where we come from in order to know where we're going. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Hamza. That was really, really great. I think Amanda will be feeding back some questions from the group and also from the YouTube comments, so that we can kind of have a brief discussion about each of the presentations and see what comes up. So I'll let you take the floor now.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. So I do have a few questions. Thank you so much for those wonderful interventions so far. And any questions that are coming up within our small group, in addition to what's come off of YouTube, please do come in when the time is appropriate. We have a lot of time. So the first question is for Chantal from Andy Higginbottom, who's a member of AGE, one of our group. He says, thank you for a great review. You mentioned Walter's connection with dependency theory. Could you expand on this? Is there a connection with Latin American currents?
Thank you, Andy, for your question. Unfortunately, I must say I'm not well versed on the dependency theory, but yes, there is a connection with Latin America. And just, if I can sort of elaborate, just the idea that through capitalism, including slavery and colonization, African societies, but not only limited to African societies, many societies around the world, Asia, Latin America, the Caribbean, have become economically dependent on Europe in terms of resources and aid, etc. So short answer, yes, there is a connection to Latin America.
Thank you. We've got another one for you from another panelist, Wazir Mohammed. He asked, does decolonization mean having Black faces, or is there a much deeper meaning?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So I think that at the core of the struggle, especially as expressed by students, there is a desire to not only see non-white professors, but also to change the curriculum. And I think this is where it's quite impactful in terms of, not only who is on the reading list, but highlighting those marginalized voices as historians, as academics such as Saidia Hartman and Christina Sharp have looked to the colonial archive and said, well, this is full of violence, obviously. And how do we ensure not to repeat that violence when we're writing about, writing histories of slavery, for example? What voices are we bringing forth? What silences can be acknowledged? So I think it's impactful in terms of the curriculum, and academics are making changes as driven by students. But I agree that there is it's a marketing tool for many institutions. And so I think decolonizing the university is not possible, but I think there can be ways in which we can, as much as possible, sort of shift some of our perspectives to the curriculum and how we teach, even though I think decolonizing the curriculum is mostly impossible to, because it's very stagnant, very limited.
Let me just come in here and say why I asked the question, because, you know, we live in a world in which we call it a multicultural world, whatever we want to call it. But we see these divisions and these binaries continuing and it's being deepened. So somebody like myself, for instance, I'm not white enough, nor am I black enough sometimes. I may be conscious, but I'm not white enough, nor am I black enough. So your equality gets circumscribed based on your skin color rather than your consciousness and your levels of consciousness. And it's a problematic that we face in real time, in the everyday. And it's, you know, somebody who may be black, but maybe an imperialist, have a seat at the table when somebody is white or close to whiteness or close to blackness, cannot get that seat at the table, although they are more conscious. And although that their mind are decolonized. And that's, I want you to think about that. I wasn't looking for an argument.
Thank you. Well, Valerie Amos, you know, I think it's a key example of that. It was, you know, I was interested in seeing how the leadership would develop at SOAS, but, you know, as you made reference to supporting the Iraq War and having that frame of mind, it didn't shift the needle, didn't change anything substantial for me and for many students of color at SOAS. So thank you.
There's such a rich discussion there as well. The other aspect I was thinking of was when you were speaking is the class element. Going back to Chinedu's point, as soon as, you know, Walter Rodney at one level was a working class scholar academic at one point in time. And the issue about whether decolonizing can also happen on a class basis. These intersections, which I know is a dirty word, but nonetheless, it gets really complicated. He did some amazing things trying though, didn't he? Which in Jamaica in particular. Okay, we can keep this conversation going. We've got a lot of time, but for the time being, I'm going to direct a question to Chinedu from Kate's Eclectic, excuse me. What are the major differences between Rodney and Fanon? And he or she indicates that they're not a historian. But if you could just give us an overview of your view on that, please.
Well, I think in my talk, I did highlight a lot of the similarities between Rodney and Fanon, especially in terms of their pessimism towards the petty bourgeoisie and how it can become a treacherous class. But I think that they did have fundamental differences, especially in terms of how they considered the role of the workers. And I think Fanon, you know, with all the respect, Fanon is the quintessential third worldist, and I encourage everybody to read his book, Wretched of the Earth, which is an amazing manifesto of anti-colonialism. Fanon had a different view on the working class, where he didn't see them as a revolutionary class. He saw them more as a kind of a labor aristocracy that actually benefited from the crumbs of imperialism. And for Fanon, the major actor of the anti-colonial movement was rather the peasantry, which was a spontaneous revolutionary force that needed to be channeled by, if you want, a group of revolutionary intellectuals. And also he had a lot of hope in the Lupan proletariat, those who live in the towns and the cities and don't have jobs and who kind of like live in slums. And so that was the revolutionary classes that Fanon kind of like identified. For Rodney, what's interesting in his work, and I think this ties in very much with his work in Guyana, is that he places a lot of hope in the working class. And this is why he looks at the working class struggles in Tanzania. And more importantly, when he's organizing within the Working People's Alliance in Guyana, he supports the strike of sugar workers and bauxite miners against the dictatorship of Fort Burnham in Guyana. I'll let the other speakers talk about that. But one of the interesting things that Rodney says in one of his speeches is that, the working classes' ability to halt labor, to use the weapon of the strike, is its most powerful tool to actually bring down the dictatorship. And what the working class needs to do in this struggle is to build, alliances with other oppressed groups in society and lead them towards liberation.
Thank you. Okay, I've got another question from you. This one from Andy Higginbottom again. We're not peasants in Tanzania also working people? You seem to identify working class with waged workers.
Sorry, excuse me.
That's for you as well. Do you want me to repeat it?
Oh, yes, please. That would be great.
Sure. Sorry. Okay. So we're not the peasants in Tanzania also working people. You seem to identify the working class with waged workers.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I think, honestly, the peasantry is a very complicated class to grapple with. I think when we look at the African continent, most peasants, I think, belong to, if you want, the lower echelons of the petty bourgeoisie. And what I mean by that is that this is a distinction that is made in Marxism. When I talked about the intelligentsia, we're talking about the upper echelon of the petty bourgeoisie. What Marx traditionally means by the petty bourgeoisie are groups of people who actually, if you want, employ their own labor, who own their little plots of land and stuff like that. And in some instances, they can be very poor and even more oppressed than the workers. And this, I think, is the case for a large section of the peasants in Africa. However, you have different agricultural formations in Africa, like, for instance, agricultural wage laborers, who work sometimes in Tanzania in the large, like, sisal and coffee plantations. And these are a section of the peasantry who are also, like, exploited and who are perhaps, much closer to the working class in that extent. So I think when we're talking about the peasantry, it's quite complicated and quite diverse. And I hope that that's a kind of a useful summary.
I think, Chinedu, you're correct, because the peasantry in Africa, the peasantry in the Caribbean, and in Guyana, Walter Rodney was very clear. He distinguished them from this idea of the peasantry in feudal Europe. And so the term peasantry is borrowed in the historiography. So it's a kind of misnomer. And Walter, in History of the Guyanese Working People, if you analyze his work, and he died early after doing that work. I'm certain that he would have clarified this some more. So yes, he connected these outgrowths, which were peasant outgrowths, with the working people in the Caribbean, because they were not peasants in the European, in the classical sense. So he classified them as being part of the working people.
Could I come in here for a moment? I think Walter went a step further, was here, and said in a work, an address, the Board of the Guyanese working class and the first sugar strikes of 1840-41 and 1847, that he was questioning the idea that the term peasantry is accurate for describing those people. He talked about them as being rural wage workers or part-time wage workers. And I think this is one of the significant features that Walter added to the historiography of the Caribbean. And it's important as an example of us questioning terminology that we receive from previous generations, some of which are really colonialist terminologies. And this gives me the opportunity to question terminology that I heard here. My ancestors were not slaves. They were enslaved Africans. And we could have a long discussion on this. Epistemology is extremely important. And I think that one of the ways forward for us is recognizing that a lot of the terminology we have accepted comes out of a Eurocentric and an oppressive epistemology. And that part of our liberation is really apprehending more clearly the phenomena that we live in. But I'm threatening to run away with this, so let's stop there.
Yeah, can I come back to
Nehusi's
point, which actually is a really good one. But I think that Rodney is clear is that when we're talking about classes, and especially about the question of class formation, it's not simply just a question of terminology. I think it's also a question of method. And what we have to do is look at, the relationships of how groups of people are related to one another through their connections to the different means of production, and see how classes emerge from that process. And this analysis has to be done thoroughly in every kind of situation and every kind of context that we involve ourselves in. And this is like something that he says a lot, against some of the more European Marxists who simply just transpose notions of class of Europe into Africa, and say, no, that's too simplistic. You can't go to Africa in the 1970s and simply say that that Niger is part of the same bourgeoisie as any other kind of class. And no, the class analysis is more complicated, and I think that's what he shows very well through his writings and speeches.
Thank you.
I wasn't seeking to reduce the exercise to mere terminology, the starting point for defining clearly or more exactly what we're dealing with. I'm going to say some more about this because it implicates, if I might use that word, Chinedle's point about class. And I would talk about the whole definition of class, especially working class, later on. So I'm signaling my intention in doing this.
But Chinedle makes a very important intervention, which is that, where Walter's methodology was taking us is that we cannot generalize and create definitions that are general, because the real processes of exploitation, which is what we're talking about, and transition of wealth from one group to another, happens in the local communities. And it is happening more and more now. This is why we cannot generalize, even on race, on ethnicity, on class, because it comes out of the real workings of the market as it operates in each local community. And I think that is where the methodology of Walter Rodney comes into play. That's where the relevance is in relationship to his scholarship, especially with regards to how you work on the developed Africa.
Thank you. I would also add it wasn't even historical work, it was grounded sociological analysis of whatever culture he was looking at, put that social formation, and this is what he does have in common, not just with dependency theorists, but specifically Marxist dependency theorists, like Marini from Brazil, in the context of a system of capitalism and imperialism. And imperialism was a class system for him. So it wasn't just that you're the bourgeoisie of your, or the landowners, or whatever it happened to be, and whatever social formation it was looking at, were the primary, the point of antagonism, but also the global chains that they were feeding into, the multinationals like Exxon in Guyana right now, that are also part of that class analysis. And it was a very Marxist analysis from my perspective, but coming from a perspective, again, of revolutionary Pan-Africanism and Marxism from the Global South, which does not simply posit, this generic, industrial working class as a revolutionary class. I do have a couple of questions or comments for Hamza, and then hopefully we can pick this up again. We've got another half hour of discussion in the second half. We've got a couple of comments, one from Anthony O'Hara towards Hamza. Thank you, Hamza, for this exposition from the inside out. Kate's eclectic says, as an educator, this resonates. Thank you. The entire world is following a Victorian British curriculum. And actually, Wazir also made a comment saying that the leaders are still copying and pasting. Check the agricultural policy of the African Union versus that of the EU. And I would add the EU trade agreements with respect to Africa and the ACP in general. There's one last question, and this is in general. Again, from Kate's Eclectic, a general question to anyone who can answer Rodney's positioning of women in his works, because white women are sidelined in capitalist patriarchy, but Black women don't exist. Think about Audre Lorde and so on. Anyone can pick that one up. Dear. Okay, I will pick it up then, actually. I'm just looking around for a book. He does talk about gender and women in a very grounded way, particularly coming out of the WPA experience, the Working People's Alliance in Guyana, where he was organizing, obviously, with his amazing wife, Dr. Patricia Rodney, but also organizers like Andaya, who has we lost her 2 years ago, but who has an amazing book out. Finally, we have a book of her writing called The Point is to Change the World. It's not, I don't think, this is where the historical side of him or his historical credentials or praxis, style of writing comes to the foreground. I think rather than talking about gender in a specific way, he notes the way women in, for example, the African village movement in Guyana following emancipation were part of the workforce, how they were oppressed in a particular way, how they were harassed in a particular way. But I think the major point is his just organizing alongside women in formations like the WPA. I'll link to Andaya's work in the chat and on the Facebook group. Are there any other interventions, any other comments?
The other thing, Amanda, is the way in which women embraced Walter Rodney and his ethos and the methodology and became equal partners in the struggle for change in Guyana, even after he was assassinated. So there was an instance during the bauxite strike in the early 1980s in Linden, where an East Indian brother a trade unionist, was arrested by the police. And it was the women in Linden who surrounded the police station and said, you can't do this. And then there was another incident during the food marches on the Western Marawi, where I'm from, where when the police came out with their guns, the inspiration of women that was brought into the struggle. Women went to the forefront and based their bosoms against the gun butts and said, today you will have to kill us first.
Thank you so much for that. Anyone else want to come in? We have a minute of Q&A time left. Okay, all right, thanks very much. I am going to, we're going to go for break for 10 minutes just to rest our eyes, a screen break. If you want to keep watching, we're going to view a few minutes, the first 10 minutes of the 1979 film, The Time and the Terror, which was produced by the Victor Hara Collective. It's a documentary examining Guyanese struggles against British colonialism and violence in 1953, set against the poems of Martin Carter. And these first 10 minutes really foreground Rodney's and the protagonism, the agency of the so-called shovelmen, the working peoples of Guyana in the lead up to the struggle. We'll see you in 10 minutes.
To begin the road. Broken land ripped like a piece of cloth. Iron cartwheel rumbling in the night. Hidden man consistent in the dark. Sea of day clean washing on the shore. Heart of orphan seeking orphanage. white man starts like a song but fades into a groan. The cupric star will burn as blue as death. His hopes are whitened, starched with grief and pain. Yet question man, his heavy laden cart, whose iron wheels will rumble in the night, whose iron wheel will spark against the stone or granite burden of the universe. To begin the road, hidden cartman fumbling for a star, brooding city like a mound of coal, till journey done, till prostrate, coughing hour, with sudden welcome take him to his dream, with sudden farewell send him to his grave.
Cartman of Decline is something that the whole rural population is very familiar with. The hardships of the cartman, the pain he goes through, the expectations of the journey. And these poems always had a very striking importance for them. They would readily understand his words and his images and pictures. Because very often there are people on that dray taking greens and ground provisions to the market for sale. The point was that we saw the poet as an artist of a peculiar kind of sensitivity who could make reality clearer to the rest of us. And in fact, what I said there was not a question of theory or theorization. It was what Martin Carter was actually engaged in doing. And this is what is meant by those lines in the poem, in the foreword, dealing with the poet being like someone with a watering can, nurturing plants. Taking the people's experiences, refining them, giving them back to the people, to strengthen the people, a kind of ideological nourishment, so to speak.
spread an atmosphere of anti-communist hysteria.
Okay, welcome back. If you would like to see the rest of the film, it was kind of an odd place to stop, but the film has been remastered with subtitles in English, and it is available on YouTube. It's called The Time and the Terror. And I will put a link to it on our Facebook group. And again, it's called Anti-Imperialists for Global Justice on Facebook. So here we are with the second half of our program. We're going to start a panel called Working People's History in Guyana. Our first speaker will be Kimani Nahusi of Temple University. And just as a bit of a background, Dr. Nahusi is Associate Professor of African American Studies at Temple University in Philadelphia. He is a multidisciplinary scholar with strong interests in language and linguistics, history, culture, and research methodology, whose research interests include Africa and its diasporas from ancient to modern times, the Caribbean, and Guyana. Okay, so welcome, Kimani.
Thank you very much, Amanda. And thanks to the organizers of this occasion, or the other organizers also, for bringing us together in this fashion to educate ourselves on the contributions of Walter Rodney to our lives, actually, and the life of this world. I propose to follow your instructions and address the question of Walter Rodney in the historiography of Guyana. And I would very much wish to append to that, writing history from below, or just history from below, because one of the points about Walter Rodney is that he just didn't only try to write history and interpret history. He tried to join with the working people and others in making history also. And I think that that's one of the things we need to frame our discussions and attempt to understand Walter Rodney with. I wouldn't waste too much time talking about what is historiography. I think we should safely conclude that most or all of us here understand that. I do want to make the point, though, that when we consider Guyana, it's important to recognize that historiography and the making of history and interpreting history, therefore, began with indigenous people in Guyana, Native Americans, Amerindians, they're different names, but they want to be called indigenous people. And I think it's important that we stick to that. And then there was colonial historiography. When Europeans intervened in other people's worlds through force, military violence, they started to write colonialist history in order to support the structures that they imposed upon other people. So that history was calculated. The information was organized in such a way to support the colonial project. And a number of Guyanese historians have noted that aspect of Guyanese historiography. We could talk about Norman E. Cameron, Elsa Gavaya, Rodney himself, Alvin Thompson, Brian Moore, David Green, Harold Nussman, and many others who have recognized that colonial history didn't serve Guyanese people in the short term. There are other people who understood very, very clearly that the accent upon European actors, who were usually the representatives of the system of the oppressors, was a hallmark of colonialist history. So governors, priests, parsons, colonial civil servants, and so on, these were the people who were privileged. And like I said, the function of colonial history was to validate the system of oppression, usually through valorizing the agents or the chief agents of that oppression. For example, the British monarchs, the European Church, and other institutions. Now, Guyanese awareness of colonialist history naturally developed over a period of time. And I think it's important for us to understand that Rodney grew up in a context in which more and more Guyanese became more and more articulate in their understanding and rejection of colonial historiography. I want to mention briefly here Chedi Jagan, Janet Jagan, Forbes Burnham, Ayusi Guyana, Martin Carter, and a number of others who, some of whom would become colleagues, some of whom became opponents of Walter Rodney. So Rodney didn't drop out of the sky from nowhere. His approach, his historiography, his radical historiography in Guyana, in writing on behalf of and for and in the interest of the working people, had gestation long before he was born. I think that one of the people we could talk about here is Norman E. Cameron. Rodney himself references Cameron and how he, Cameron that is, wrote a text called The Evolution of the Negro in 2 volumes. And he was really talking about African people being connected to ancient Egypt. And all of this is important in ways that you would recognize. I mentioned George G.M. James in this conversation earlier, where George G.M. James wrote a text that was first published in 1954 called Stolen Legacy. And James articulated how African people in ancient Egypt were really the people who, shall we say, informed the Greeks, and from the Greeks, the Romans, and therefore other Europeans. And that the legacy of ancient Egypt was stolen because Europeans copy quite a lot from ancient Egypt without acknowledging it. Now, that, I could say, is part of the legacy of Rodney. Of course, people like C.L.R. James, Marcus Garvey, and a whole lot of other Caribbean intellectuals and Guyanese intellectuals formed part of the context in which Rodney is going to receive his education and develop. The ultra-left tendency within the original PPP, I think, is an important intellectual influence upon Walter Rodney. You know, or we tend to know the people in that tendency: Ayusi Guyana, Martin Carter, Rory Resmus, Lionel Jeffrey, Eric Huntley, and a few others who really started to challenge Chedi Jagan's wooden static interpretation of Marxism. And I think this is important because it's the first time in Guyana we're beginning to see a far more creative interpretation of Marxism. And Rodney would deepen that vision. It's interesting that when our brother Chinedu earlier, when we had a brief discussion just now, we mentioned the way in which Rodney is, we didn't use the term creative, but this is how he's applying Marxism. And it's important for us to see that it has its, well, a previous incarnation in Guyana, and the ultra-left tendency would break Chedi Jagan inside the original PPP. And part of this is because they were developing their understanding of Marxism so quickly. So all of this is part of the context in which Walter Rodney's awareness, I would argue, developed. Now, Rodney himself made some very, very distinctive contributions to the historiography of Guyana. And in talking about that, I just want to mention very briefly some of the texts that we could look in doing this. The primary one, in a certain way, would be, of course, A History of the Guyanese Working People, which has been mentioned before. I would also put groundings with my brothers in there. I mentioned this text, The Birth of the Guyanese Working Class and the Forest Sugar Strikes, 1840-41 and 1847. It's an address that was given in one of the Caribbean islands and reprinted. And he's talking about the way in which the working people in Guyana contributed to processes going on. Then the Kofi Badu out of Africa and Lashmi out of India. These are two very important texts because they're written for children, but they're also addressing the question of race and racism in Guyana. And of course, there are Guyanese sugar plantations. Those are the major texts. There are other ones, addresses, and of course, all his speeches on the streets of Guyana, some of which have been produced in print. People's Power, No Dictator as a good example. All these are the materials for the understanding, the writing and reciting of Guyanese history. Now, Rodney made some very, very distinctive contributions to Guyanese historiography, as I have said. And one of them, perhaps the most important one, is the intervention on the side of the people. The working people, I think, is his terminology. And I believe that that's the one should be preferred because it doesn't risk getting confused with the question of class, although Rodney uses that term also. I think the more precise term is working people because the people referred to weren't yet a class in the classical Marxist sense of having a consciousness of being together and B, developing organization to articulate their interests as a single group of people. The question of race continued to divide much of this group of people substantially. And I think it's one of those things we need to address. Now, Rod intervened in writing and doing history on the side of those people because he believed, as George Lamming would say in the introduction to the history of the Guyanese working people, that Rodney understood history as a way of organizing information, the facts of our lives, and getting people to understand that and act in their own interests. And I think that's a very, very potent contribution to the historiography of Guyana. And I think that we must also see it as simultaneously, not merely something that's locked up in books and discussions, but something that informed action on the streets. So here Rodney is demonstrating his supreme intellectual talent, ability. I mentioned the peasantry before, that Rodney understood that the people we call the peasantry was not really a peasantry, that they were rural workers, and that perhaps we could call them a rural proletariat. And this is not something new. AUC Guyana and Trico Guyana made that point also. In terms of culture, Rodney recognized culture and his whole discourse on Black power and the way in which Blackness included everybody who is not white in the Caribbean is something we could mine for far more meaning. I mentioned his intervention on the side of children just now, and I think that that's of the greatest importance. The tradition of doing history and writing history and studying history, therefore, that Rodney contributed to the historiography of Guyana, in one in which he attempted to, and I think successfully, intervened on the side of the people and write history, think history, talk history, teach history, and do history in the interest of the vast majority of the people of Guyana. In closing, I could mention also that part of this was that he didn't just look at the people of Guyana, the working people, in isolation from the middle class, and we know what he thought about the middle class and the ruling class. He also understood that everyone in Guyana, and especially the working people, were buffeted by international currents that often impacted very massively and negatively upon their lives. So Rodney's historiography is one that Wazir pointed out just now. It looked at the specifics, at the local conditions, and attempted to understand what was happening in those particularities. But at the same time, he never imagined them or recognized them to be completely isolated from other currents that dictated or at least impacted upon the lives of the people he was examining. I think I'll stop.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll turn now to Wazir Mohammed. Wazir is an associate professor of sociology at Indiana University East in Richmond, Indiana. He is a Guyanese and former colleague of Walter Rodney in the struggle for a multiracial Guyana. As a member and leader of the WPA, the Working Peoples Alliance, Dr. Mohammed spent 25 years of his young life and rose to the rank of co-leader of that party before leaving to pursue graduate studies in Binghamton, New York in 2000. Over to you.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you to the organizers for taking this initiative. I want to frame Rodney today, his academic work, his scholarly work within the politics of the struggle against imperialism and colonialism, because, and I think that is necessary. So I begin by saying this: in these dreaded times of the rule of the market, the rule of the few, the rule of old and new imperialisms, and the moment of neoliberal politics and the economy, this discourse is relevant, and we have to take this discourse from here into the classroom and into the communities. We have recently celebrated 41 years since Walter Rodney was assassinated in Guyana. Yes, I would say he was assassinated in one place at a particular time and juncture, but his history of struggle for social justice is far wider than the struggles for multiracial democracy in Guyana, as some of the speakers have already mentioned. Assassination, therefore, did not silence his voice. Rodney continues to speak through his scholarship. And why is that? Because Rodney spoke truth to power. Walter Rodney's life was about recapturing the history of the working peoples. That is what he spent his academic life doing. He believed that the working peoples of the world are owed the truth. And I want you to underline that word. And thus his calling was to find and to tell the truth. He therefore made reality of exploitation clearer for those who are exploited in society. This is why he grounded in Jamaica with the Rastafari. But telling the truth in Jamaica to the Rastafari and to the working people of Jamaica led to his banning in 1968. You see, governments fear the truth. Fear of the truth led to the 1974 denial of a job at the University of Guyana. And telling the truth led to his killing in 1980. And since then, fear of the truth has led to him being assassinated time and again in some sections of the press. As we reflect on his connections to working people, a pertinent question, therefore, we have to ponder. Why is it there is this over-concentration on Rodney? Why people fear Rodney? We answer this question through an examination of his practice. The over-concentration are related to attempts to bury the fact that his practice was always about challenging the status quo. That is, the ruling classes. By status quo and ruling classes, I mean the old political structures, what he called the old politics of divide and rule, the old politics of collusion against the interests of the masses of working people and the powers that keep colonialism alive, today the neo-colonialists and the neoliberalists. Walter Rodney was firmly against the old politics of divide and rule, ethno-national politics, ethno-national political parties, and ethno-national political mobilization. This is why he never found favor or supported any of the existing political leaders and old parties in Guyana. He was banned from Jamaica and denied a job in Guyana for the simple fact that he was perceived as a threat to those who inculcated and espoused the colonial mentality, what Frantz Fanon famously called black skins and white masks. Essentially, wherever he went, the beneficiaries of the anti-colonial movements and struggles, the new status quo, the new ruling classes, or the new political leaders saw him as a threat. Most of them kept their views privately. Brother Chinedu made mention of what happened in Tanzania. And a few boisterous ones expressed their views openly and through actions. Hence, we saw what happened in Jamaica and in Guyana. Recently, we were treated to some crumbs from the political directorate of Guyana. They announced that his books will now be able to see the light of day in Guyana. Let me ask you to reflect on that for a moment. Think about why Rodney's writing should depend on the behest of politics and political directorates for them to emerge in broad daylight. Think about the politics of the political system. Can freedom wait for political leaders to decide what we should or should not read? I'm reminded of a conversation I had with an author in the United States who once told me of one of the US presidents praising his books for political gain. But in the words of that author, and I quote, "I am certain he never read my books." This is a conundrum of our times. Rather than just say the books will be available, leaders should establish study circles within the leadership to read and study the books. Don't make pronouncements, so that they could make informed judgments on why these books are necessary, why they should be available in schools. I recall a conversation with one of Guyana's many presidents who asked, "Wazir, what would you do if you were president?" My response was, "Study and understand history, and that would help you in organizing your thoughts and ideas on development." Today, in all areas of the world, the beneficiaries of the wealth and resources are the few. This abounds across the Caribbean, in Africa, in Asia, and the Americas. All areas of virulent anti-colonial, independence, and civil rights struggles of the 20th century. Why is this? It is because of misguided leadership. It is because, as Rodney pointed out in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, lopsided development takes place because of underdevelopment. Let us, for a single moment, stop to ask, is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa one of the books used for study circles of the leadership in Africa today? Or are there study circles? Is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa no longer relevant? Let us take a moment to examine the relevance of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Rodney gives us two primary concepts in the chapter on development, in which he explained that development implies an increasing capacity to regulate both internal and external relationships. He then explains that underdevelopment is a counterpoint, as something that happens not only because of European imperialism, and underline this point, but more importantly, because of the role of local colluders, because of local collusion, without whom imperialism cannot succeed. So let us examine what Rodney means by underdevelopment. He says, progressive loss, now the first point he makes, is that progressive loss by a society over the control of its own destiny. Underdevelopment is the progressive loss by a society over the control of its own destiny. Underdevelopment is the emergence and strengthening of structures of external dependency in the economy, in health, in education, in culture, and in the state. Underdevelopment is a net transfer of resources. Underdevelopment is the growing gap between the dominant and dominated nations and between the dominant groups and the dominating within countries. Underdevelopment is the consolidation of a pattern of social stratification, whereby local economic and political elites benefit magnificently from while the masses at the bottom experience marginal progress. And underdevelopment is increasing social tensions and conflict. The country that I'm from, Guyana, we have had increasing social tensions and conflict and all the other points I made here since 1955 and before. I invite you to think about the inferences that could be drawn. Look at our societies today. How Europe underdeveloped Africa gives us the methodology to understand why wealth, that is development and squalor underdevelopment, expands in our neighborhoods. Rodney is clear that much of the squalor is related to the role of local colluders, the beneficiaries of the struggles of the working peoples for freedom and change. It is not my intention to go into the litany of abuses. Today, everything is blamed on globalization. Let me remind ourselves that all production, all work, and life exists in local communities. Now imagine like Rodney did. If local leaders did not collude or accept the dictates of the imperial powers, what could have been the likely outcome? Imagine if they understood and understands the local terrain, then use that to negotiate and regulate external relationships. Let me ask you another question. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? The proverbial question. If we give up control because of personal avarice and greed to the external forces with whom they partner, is development or underdevelopment going to be the outcome? Most times we are quick and it becomes very easy to blame imperialism. Rodney did blame imperialism, but explained that imperialism succeeds to the extent that they are willing participants at home. Today, Guyana is being recolonized by Exxon. How did this happen? Why did the country accept the terms of the contract that gave away the store? Today, Haitians and Cubans require visas to enter Guyana. Why the first free peoples in the Americas, who charted a path forward for freedom for all working peoples, not have equal rights to travel? Whom do we blame for these travesties? Imperialism or local colluders? Without an educated population who understands the role of the working people in creating better and equal societies, let me ask the question, is development possible? Now, these are central questions that belongs in Rodney's ethos. Many take issue with his radicalism and privately remarks, only if he were less radical, he would have been alive. We should be reminded that assassination is not a single act. It is the sum of a series of acts. I've argued elsewhere that he was assassinated because of his scholarship. His scholarship challenged the political and economic status quo. Now imagine what is wrong about the children's books he wrote, about the history of the Guyanese working people, and so forth. That would have caused the official, unofficial banishment of his scholarly works in Guyana for 41 years. The period of rule of 2 or 3 different governments. Ask ourselves why, although dead, he's still banned in Jamaica, and why at best students are expected to learn about the contents of his scholarly works in a second-hand manner. There was a time when all undergraduates at the University of Dar es Salaam were exposed to his works, but today, a student at the same institution can obtain a bachelor's degree in history without having ever read How Europe Underdeveloped Africa from cover to cover. Today, even governments that came to power and are the beneficiaries of the liberation, independence, and anti-colonial struggles silently accedes to the narrative that the examination of historical underdevelopment and the real histories of the working peoples are not necessary. The beneficiaries of the struggle of the people for genuine independence colludes with the general expunging of anti-capitalist texts from education systems As a result, the use of the history of the Guyanese working people, grounding with my brothers, how we were up on the developed Africa and so forth, has waned considerably in universities, especially in Africa, Guyana, and the Caribbean. Walter Rodney did not implore young scholars to study him. He implored us to understand that the historiography of our peoples, the working peoples, is highly, in his words, underdeveloped. By saying that, he was quoting Elsa Govaya. He says that there is a huge gap which we have to cover. What he meant was that the time was reached for us to examine history as written. And when we put it under scrutiny, we will find that it was written from the standpoint, the point of view of the oppressor class. Today we see the same thing happening. People are writing history as though those who made the history are not present, as though facts are not facts. How did Rodney explain the huge gap in his historiography? In a 1978 lecture in Binghamton, he said that what we have is there is a whole historical era. The post-slavery era has not been seriously dealt with by any of the historians. In pursuing this path, he referenced the difference between Guyana and the Caribbean and why history is written misses the point. Most people concentrate, he argues, on the labor shortage theory, which was sold by the representatives of the capitalist plant and colonial classes. But Rodney explained that if the labor shortage theory is correct, why were Africans not given work as a matter of rule on the sugar plantations after 1848? And why did sugar in Guyana not decline as it did in the many other Caribbean countries? He helps us begin to comprehend why indentured labor was introduced. He explained that the plantation, the capitalist institution in Guyana in the period of the sugar revolution, required labor, in his words, of a certain type. That labor of a certain type, or contract labor, as we know, accepted the wage rates that were equivalent to the rates the enslaved received in the period of apprenticeship. Rodney helps us to understand that by writing the real history, we would learn as the indentured became free of their contracts, they ended up and established themselves in the free villages the Africans had established. And that most of these villages, East Indians lived in harmony with Africans until after the politics of ethnic division entered in 1955. We would learn that African labor engaged in the popular exercise of freedom, and that for 25 years they created the local government systems and village councils in Guyana. This scholarship, I would argue, is very important to understand the makeup, the division that ensues, the conflict inherited, and if we do that, we can find common solutions. So his call was for new scholarship, probing scholarship to emerge, to find common solutions. In concluding these remarks, I would urge that we situate his political speeches in the context of his scholarship. His urging and striving for multiracial unity and people's power of the working people in Guyana was directly connected and related to his scholarship. The same is true for his striving in Jamaica, captured in Groundings with My Brothers, and his striving in the liberation struggles in Africa and the struggles for civil rights in the United States. And likewise, his arguments for us to rethink the ideas of Pan-Africanism. He believed that the ideas of Pan-Africanism must consider the role and place of other working peoples of color who were brought to the Caribbean. I hope that we will continue to draw inspiration and build on the scholarship. This will be the best way to celebrate Walter Rodney's legacy. In this time of the rising of the Black Lives Matter movement and the call for reparation and reparative justice, the scholarship and methodologies left us by Rodney can be used as an important tool in clarifying our roles in this vital, local, and global issue. I close by saying there is a connection between his scholarship and his scholarship of practice and activism. Thank you.
Thank you, Wizard, very much. And that leads very well into our last intervention by Cecil Gutsmore. I have a very anemic bio for Cecil that doesn't do what he's accomplished justice, but it will give you a flavor. Cecil Gutsmore is an African Jamaican. He is a retired academic and remains a fully committed activist in the struggle for race, class, and gender liberation. Over to you, Cecil.
Good to be with you. Glad to be amongst the organizers of this event. Hesitant, even fearful to follow some of the contributors we've already had, especially Professor Nahusi, who is a genuine historian of Guyana. I have his massive book, and no doubt there are others on the subject. Having said that, it's clear to me, as it will be to everybody else, that Walter Rodney did not lead a successful revolution. And yet it is important to recognize him as an outstanding 20th century revolutionary on the basis of his revolutionary Pan-Africanist practice. Through that practice, Rodney contributed fundamentally to the theoretical and practical development of Marxism and nationalism, the specific form of nationalism being Pan-Africanism. And those two are indisputably the two great, differently informed and related revolutionary movements of the 20th and perhaps the 21st century. The latter is to be seen. So my focus here is on the truth of the claim that I just made, that Walter is a significant revolutionary, as it applies to the final period of his tragically shortened life, to the last 6 years between 74 and 80, spent in his birthplace, then and still called the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, and we're going to refer to it as Guyana after this, and as everybody else has done so far, where Rodney bravely and brilliantly pursued the rich practice that is the basis of my claim just given about the need for us to recognize him as one of the significant revolutionaries of the 20th century. As should be well known, capitalism, imperialism in its neocolonial form, then run by its agents, that is to say, Forbes Burnham, his clique, and his close supporters in Guyana, attempted ultimately, terminally, to prevent Rodney spending those years either at all or in any politically effective way in the country of his birth. They killed him when their multi-layered effort failed. Despite the efforts of that neocolonial clique and its state, Walter Rodney produced Guyanese historical political economy of the highest order after being deprived, as we've already been told, by Burnham of his chair in history in the University of Guyana. He thereafter, 1974, engaged unflinchingly against bourgeois and petit bourgeois power and class positions, however these manifested, and specifically in Guyana, as economic exploitation of the Guyanese masses, brutal state power, and some very shameless ideological forms of oppression. The first of these is visible in the fact that Burnham's state emasculated labor organizations and overtly and covertly fought the Guyanese working class over the most basic of its rights and its economic demands. The point has already been made in earlier presentation. What I call ruthless ideological forms are most relevantly masquerade as academic socio-historical studies of Guyana. And I'm going to talk briefly about that, more about that later. And also it manifests as a kind of backward form of African nationalism. Now, the latter, that is to say, this backward African nationalism, construed South Asians or Indo-Guyanese into the principal enemy of African Guyanese, and made capturing and holding Guyanese state power allegedly against Indo-Guyanese, but actually objectively for imperialism, as the only legitimate political task of serious African Guyanese. On the basis of this narrow race nationalism, some found it possible, and I heard this personally, to say Walter Rodney does not understand race. I heard those words in an organization in London where I regularly delivered African political history. And after Walter came in one of the weeks when I wasn't speaking and delivered on Guyana, one of the leaders of that organization said to me, maybe in the Wednesday of the following week, Rodney does not understand race. Now, sorry, something's happened to my text here. So we have Walter Rodney returning to Guyana, and he has to cope with a very specific situation, which it matters that we understand. It matters that we understand the nature of the moment. It matters that we understand that a fully entrenched neocolony, willing to use ideology to the max, but also willing to use physical brutality to the max. And ideology included mockery of Walter Rodney, which didn't end at his death. We happen to know that when they killed him, and the people who did it obviously had pre-knowledge, so they had prepared, including preparing ideological material mocking Walter. Their plan to some extent failed. The bomb exploded and killed him, but he had instructions as to how to hold it. And it is fortunate that even though it killed him, the explosion didn't project upwards in a way that destroyed his face. And so all of the Burnham's regime's propaganda, mocking propaganda, related to an unidentified miscreant who'd blown himself up close to a prison in Guyana. Now, they didn't drop that ideological, mocking, shameless thrust, even though his brother, who was meant also to be killed, was sitting next to him and survived. Incidentally, as we've already been told, they charged the brother with complicity in the murder. But it matters that our comrade sister Andaye went to the scene and recognized him immediately. So his family and everybody knew that Walter Rodney had been killed. The mockery of that wicked regime extended to maintaining the myth that some unidentified person had been killed, and they held on to his body without refrigeration until decay set in. And Walter's body was only attended to by an undertaker. I have this from his wife, because of respect for him and the family. There's an irony in the story. Burnham had a plan to have himself preserved and exhibited in a mausoleum. The plan involved taking his body to the Soviet Union, where they are very good at these things. When his body got there, it had not been properly stored or shipped. And so the Russians had to tell the Guyanese, we cannot embalm this body for you. And the rest is history. Burnham does not lay in a mausoleum for exactly the reason that the way he treated Walter's body. So, mockery, but excess brutality was a characteristic of that state. It matters that their brutality, their mockery, included depriving Rodney's organization of the main means of communication in this era, which is printing. They stopped printing machinery, which was bought, shipped in from Trinidad, confiscated. And you can read all about that and more in the interview that Rodney did in '76 with Colin Prescott. It appears in the pages of Race and Class. That regime was determined by terror. We saw a film earlier, Terror in the Time. This is another time of terror, the late 70s in Guyana, when that regime imported a body called the House of Israel, who were thugs, African-American thugs, imported into Guyana to do the kind of work that Eric Geary's Mongoose Gang in Grenada and Papa Doc's Tonto Macoute did in Haiti. These people destroyed meetings, beat up individuals on their own, and beat up people assembled in open public political meetings. Terrorism. And in the end, it extended to killing Walter Rodney in the circumstances where those who carried it out and organized it had a plan for communicating around it, which I've partially described. Now, Walter, despite all of that, succeeded in producing a body of work which is theoretically exemplary. He succeeded in producing a body of work which embraced the popular and the highly theoretical political economic history of the terrain. It appears in all kinds of places. Incidentally, there is a very good biography of Walter by Professor Rupert Lewis, which anybody who even begins to want to understand Walter Rodney could benefit from sitting down and reading. In the bibliography pages, the publications that Walter produced during the 6 years of his life in Guyana are listed there. They are very impressive indeed. The most impressive of these is the book already mentioned, is History of the Guyanese Working People, and it's a very short period. No doubt he would have given us volumes prior to that and volumes after that and other volumes on that post-emancipation period. Incidentally, the book was left unfinished and Comrade Sister and I actually tidied it up for publication. Now, I said that he did great political work popularly and also seriously theoretical academic work. The popular work includes the children's books that have already been mentioned, but his speeches, speeches that became publications, including a very important one, I think is called People's No Democracy, right? I know I've been told that I have 2 minutes. I'll take a little bit longer than that, but not much longer than that. Yeah. Now, why is his major book that came out the year after he died? Yeah, thank you. People's Power, etc. That one, right? Very important popular work. Now, why is his book on the Guyanese working class, peasantry, call them what you will, agro-proletarian, call them what you will. There's lots of terminology available, some of which was developed before Rodney did his work for describing the class articulation in our regional societies. Now, there is a great deal in that book. What is important for me is the way in which he challenged the existing orthodox orthodoxy around relations between the Indian section of the Guyanese working people and the African section of Guyanese working people. Obviously, the former predated obviously the latter predated the former. The Africans got there first, we know. We know, and it's already been mentioned, why the Indians were brought in to facilitate cheap labor in order to undermine the modes of struggle of the pre-existing population. That was a basis for disagreement, disharmony, undoubtedly, between the two communities, and there was some of it. What the orthodoxy that Rodney challenged on that matter was that because of how the Indians were brought in, and because colonialism promoted the racial divide, that there was a primordial, that's the word in the scholarship, hatred between Indians and Africans in Guyana, and that what happened in the 60s and in the 50s and 60s, violence between the two groups, was just the culmination of a pattern of violence that, right. Now, Walter said that isn't true. And he used key concepts. He said that in order for there to be violence between groups, now it admittedly can be caused by enough things, but importantly, you have to have a genuine antagonistic contradiction between groups. And if you don't have it, and that primarily arises from exploitation, relations of exploitation. Such relations of exploitation did not exist between Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese in the post-emancipation period. And Walter did more than that. He said that if no antagonistic contradiction existed, then you will not find evidence for the claim that's being made, which is that violence had been a key characteristic of that relationship in the post-emancipation period. And what you do, and what he did, and he's immensely good at it, was go back to the historical record and search and find the evidence. And what the evidence showed, and nobody has disputed it since, is that the violence between Indians and Africans in Guyana in the whole of the post-emancipation period was, the word he uses, piddling, very small, it's in the book, very small instances, some of which can be analyzed, and he does this, leading to conclusions that it's not really about conflicting ethnicity at all. It's actually about power positions, the way in which, for example, Indians got appointed to police African villages, or Africans got appointed to police Indian villages, and so on, and a whole heap of other stuff. And he says, and the evidence is there, that when you see conflict, when you see conflict between groups, you really have to go and analyze it. And because he didn't just read the archival material, but looked at then current historical scholarship, Walter talks in his book about violence within the working class in Britain in the 19th century, and explains that, and says, right, these are two working class groups, there's violence between them, you have to explain it. And you can't explain it in terms of race, and the same applies frequently in Guyana. Now, the effect of what Walter did was to provide a basis for the mode of organization that he entered into, the WPA, which was interethnic. There's much more to Walter's book. The two concepts of race, the fact that the dominant concept of race applies to white power versus non-white blacks in Guyana. It matters that in the Cold War, and in, therefore, the 50s and 60s, imperialism systematically promoted race division, race conflict, if you will, racial interest in Guyana. And Walter's work provides the basis for holding and understanding and organizing on the basis that the enemy in Guyana, the Indians' enemy, isn't African, and that the Africans' enemy isn't Indians, but the system that has managed, despite the early, more or less cordial relations, to have them at each other's throats, and that if Guyana is to progress and not make the kind of mistake that the ruling circle is presently making, which is to ignore Walter's work on foreign direct capital investment, if they'd paid even a moment heed to that work. He has an important lecture which he gave in 1971 in the United States, which turns up in a journal called Ufahamu. And in that, he makes it clear that foreign capital of that kind is the basis on which capitalism gets hold of our resources, uses those resources to pay for the investment, and ends up owning without actually putting anything, because it gets recycled via amortization and taxation and all of that back into the country. Exactly what is happening in Guyana now, but in a very horrendous and dangerous, threatening way. It is a pity, therefore, that we're only just getting to the business of reading Walter's work, because it would be not just transformational, but protective of our interests, because we'd understand our interests better than we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecil. Okay, we have a few questions, one from the live stream and the rest from our other panelists for a group of really rich interventions. The first one is from Rada de Souza to Wazir. She said, you located Rodney's scholarship within the context of struggles of the Guyanese people very well. How do you see present day initiatives by universities in Western countries to incorporate decolonizing curriculum in the university system? In other words, how do you see the attempts to mainstream decolonizing curriculum in the higher education sector today? And if Chantal also wants to come in on this, I think that would be fine.
Well,
to be honest,
the way I would attempt to answer that is that, I mean, there was never any, I mean, the Europe-centric approach to education has always been the template upon which the universities are organized. There is really no attempt in any place to really decolonize the curriculum. We would know that if we see, for instance, in general education courses, when history is a part of a general education core, that every student who graduates is able to understand African American history. History, I mean, for students to understand African American, they have to take African American history as an elective. So any attempt, any idea of decolonization of the curriculum must include treating the people's history as part of the curriculum, that is the general education core. So long as teaching the people's history is not part of the general education core, any talk about decolonizing the curriculum, all it is talk.
Thank you very much.
okay, I would like to say a word or two. I've never been impressed by the talk about decolonizing curriculum, or about why isn't my, any lecturer my black. I understand the desire to have people like us in universities, but it is odd that decades after formal colonialism ended, that the thrust around this matter focuses on colonialism, as if what is being taught isn't straightforward capitalist ideological rubbish, and as if that is not what has to be fought and defeated. And so it may just be that it's easier to say colonial than to say capitalism, imperialism, but it is capitalism, imperialist ideology that is the enemy of working people everywhere, Black and white, Asian and Latin American, in the academy, right? And so I've never really been impressed by the thrust of decolonizing the curriculum, although I think I understand what is being attempted.
I just want to quickly say one thing. The reason why the question of decolonization is important is because where did race come from? Where did racism come from? Remember, it occurred within the construct of Atlantic slavery. It did not happen because of Atlantic slavery. The division, the division based on how close one is to whiteness or how one is to blackness, those ways in which prejudice and the prejudicial structures and cultures got established and becomes part of the sociology of these communities is colonial. And so we have to decolonize the curriculum.
One further little, for me, colonialism is one of the modes of oppression of capitalism, imperialism. Obviously, racism was attached to it and is fundamental to capitalism, imperialism in the last 500 years. The stuff that gets taught in universities is not different or not much different now to what it was whilst colonialism was in place. But the objective state of affairs isn't anything to do with colonialism. It's certainly to do with racism, but fundamentally it's to do with what capitalism, imperialism, and its agents decide that they want to teach in places like this or in places like the Caribbean. And so I understand why people have said decolonizing the curriculum, because maybe it's easier to say that, but colonialism is no longer the enemy. And if we were going to be strict, and we were talking about Africa or the Caribbean, it would be the neocolonial curriculum that we'd be having to challenge. And indeed, we'd have to challenge that in those places.
Let me just ask a quick question of you, because what you're saying assumes that in the Caribbean, we don't have to decolonize the mind.
I repeat that clearly colonialism mattered. And in places like the Caribbean, colonial forms of education are still there. Most of the moves around decolonizing curricula are here, not there. You won't find any decolonizing curriculum movement among students or the populace in the Caribbean. There's a little bit of it in South Africa for the specific reasons that apply there. So the thrust is something that comes from the metropoles. And in the metropoles, I'm saying that while colonialism is part of the history and the racism of the colonial era and now is part of the history and the now, what we have to tackle is the curriculum that racist imperialism imposes upon us and upon white people for its own, in its own interest.
Very good. Okay, I've got a question. Chantal, you sure you don't want to come in?
Just very briefly to say I agree with Hamza and Cecil's interventions. I think this is a really intriguing question and discussion. I think it's very much alive in universities amongst, you know, staff as well as students. And even thinking, so I said before, but I think that decolonized institution is near impossible, is impossible. And that doesn't mean that there are individual efforts, especially around decolonizing the curriculum. And I think about, especially as an academic who's new to the UK, even though I grew up here, that tells you something. But the whole REF system, the research excellence framework, right? You know, who does it serve? Who is refable? What kind of ideas are accepted? And that's what brings the institutional / department funding who is employed, etc. And also I support efforts by, for example, establishing a free Black university, as well as efforts that people of African heritage have made themselves to educate ourselves, such as the supplementary school system or school.
Different matter.
Yeah, these, yes, but I think this is so important, especially in self-education, right? And training young academics, those who want to be academics, those who enter the school system.
Okay, just to say we do have this space for another hour and a half, so I do want to get to the final comments in about 15 minutes, but if we don't get there and we push things ahead a little bit, that's totally fine, because the conversation's got a life unto itself, and I agree that it's a really vital conversation. This question is from Chantel to everyone. Can any of the speakers say more about places where Rodney's work was and is currently banned? And Wazir came in and kind of gave it a bit more nuance by saying they're not officially banned. The ruling parties use control over the state apparatus to enforce their non-appearance, but it's certainly something that pops up every so often with an op-ed by George Lamming or something, saying there's still no presence. There's still, people don't know who he is in Guyana. Does anybody want to take that?
Let me say briefly that what happens popularly and what happens in universities, back to the Caribbean now, it is kind of different. There's no Rodney and, for example, very little Garvey in any Caribbean school age curriculum. And it would be odd if there was. There is some in the university. At University of the West Indies, Mona, I taught a course on Caribbean revolutions, which included Walter's work. And we actually taught Walter very seriously in the way that we taught Garvey. But that was for, the people who were doing those courses in the Department of Government, and nobody else got it. I don't know, to be honest, what the history department did, but Chantel spent a little time in the history department at the University of the West Indies, and she might remember what they did with Walter. The whole business of how Africa and the Caribbean in the allegedly decolonizing moment, the moment of independence, restructured curricula, remains an absolutely crucial issue for everybody. Now, as it happens, that moment coincided with the appearance of some very good African scholars who said some important things about the nature of enslavement, about the nature of trading relations between states in West Africa, trading states in West Africa. And so that historical achievement is there, but it didn't represent anything like the basis for the radical reconstituting of the African curriculum. It applies the Caribbean to Continental Africa. So all of that stuff still has to be done. I mentioned, I think before we got on air, that Walter was involved in trying to recast history as a subject to be taught and practiced in East Africa. I've never seen what the curriculum that they produced is. I have one other experience, which is somebody called Dani Nabuderi, who's now dead, and another friend of mine who's also now dead, had a project to develop a Pan-African history course for the whole of Africa. I'm afraid they got no funding. No African government, we're working out of Namibia and Uganda, no government, none of those governments and no other African government was interested, and the Ford Foundation and UNESCO weren't interested. So we've got a long way to go.
Can I jump in here?
Of course.
Let us begin or continue with the clear understanding that the structures that exist to continue the exploitation of the working people,
yes,
and the enrichment of foreign capitalist class, as well as the local hangers on, the people Africans and Caribbean people, who we usually call the middle class for the most, who benefit or think they benefit from the crumbs that fall from the tables of imperialism. This is the structure that Rodney fought against. And these are the people who are still in power. And I don't think we should be overtly surprised that they fear Walter Rodney and they fear his work. And many of those people are still trying to assassinate Walter Rodney. Of course, they've assassinated him physically, but they're trying to do it politically, ideologically, scholarly, and so on. And we've got to be aware of the outlines of the battle conditions that we're talking about here. My own experience, and I see Wazir, I think was urging me to do this, to talk about my own, one part of my experience, but I'll talk about two experiences. Some years ago, I was asked to be a consultant to a Caribbean Examinations Council curriculum on, I think it was religion in the Caribbean. And I had to tell people, or that group of people, that religious education is something different from the study of religion. What they wanted to do was religious education, because, as I pointed out to them, there was something about Christianity, and it was the received notion of Christianity, received from the people who did the worst crimes in human history and used or abused Christianity to tie off the minds of African people so they could continue to do their dirty work among us. Judaism, yes, Judaism was going to be studied in the Caribbean. There was something about Islam, and that was it. So I said, what happened to Rastafari, Candomblé, Santiera, Jordanites, all of these so-called African-derived religion? And people fought against it. You know, they fought tooth and nail to make certain that a study of religion in the Caribbean would remain the study of Christianity in its most backward sense, not even asking questions like, where does Christianity come from? Not even getting to the point of saying that a lot of Christianity was developed by Africans in Africa. And these ideas and practices have been looted by white people and turned against the very source of these things as an oppressing religion. So that's one thing I want to offer. The second thing I want to offer is the experience of the Walter Rodney chair. Now, we may argue that the PPP government, not the current one, but the one before, who came up with the idea of the Walter Rodney history chair at the University of Guyana, was being or may have been opportunistic. And I certainly think that that's a question that needs to be asked because of when it was put forward and the circumstances and so on. I'm not going to argue it's a bad thing. I'm going to say that it's much needed by Guyanese people. And I applied for the chair, and I was appointed. And then there was nothing. And then the position was re-advertised, and I was appointed to that chair once again. Part of the agreement, as I understand it, is that the Ministry of Education would pay for the operationalizing of that chair, while it's the University of Guyana that administers it. Well, the Ministry of Education, under the government that has just been replaced, I'm talking about the APNU government, which contains the PNC as the leading party, did not honor the obligation to pay for that chair. Now, this seems significant to me because perhaps the only logical way of seeking to understand that is as a continuation of the very vulgar attempt to delete the presence of Walter Rodney from Guyana and from conversations and scholarship in Guyana. Let us remember that around the same time, there was a strange happening where, put it mildly, the government as it existed then went behind the backs of the Guyanese public to pull down the name of the National Archives as the Walter Rodney Archives on the very curious pretext that the thing was not gazetted. And, you know, we have this kind of puerile backwardness that represents the policy of a group of people who masquerade in the racial politics of Guyana as representing African Guyanese. I mean, Walter would have had no truckers, but I'm saying that even at the most elementary, perhaps even vulgar level of racial politics, you would have expected that group of people to say, well, yes, you know, we want something to happen here and it's in our interest or in the interest of the people who we serve. No, it didn't happen. And anyway, you turn it or twist it, it is a very, very serious attack on scholarship, on history, on the education of the Guyanese people. And I think that this is one of the ways in which we continue to see both the potency and the danger for people of Walter Rodney scholarship and what he represents.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'd like to make a democratic decision here. We've got a few more questions. Are you happy to go over maybe 15 minutes to take them?
Yes.
We still have.
I would definitely. Sorry.
Okay.
Let me respond. I would definitely go over because I'll have to run away from this gathering, not because I want to, but because of a previous engagement immediately after then, much to my regret, but I'm hoping that I will be of some service in the future.
Appreciate it. We definitely need to keep this going at some level. Okay, the next question was from Kevin, who had to excuse himself. He said, thanks for the mention of Rodney's children's books. I'd just like to briefly ask how readily available they are in Guyana, continuing this theme, and whether they are among those of Rodney's books that are to be featured in school curriculum. Given that they fight against the divide and rule strategies that Cecil is speaking to, how important is it to get it to Guyanese children?
Okay.
Should I have a go for it? I could answer.
Yes, Kimani, please.
Okay, yeah. I could answer part of that question. I don't know how readily they are available in Guyana right now. I think my brother Wazir might be able to tell us something about that, or at least I'm hoping so. I put my hands on all kinds of things, materials from Guyana, and certainly as soon as those books came out, I tried to get them. I don't have a copy of the one on India, you know, but I got Kofi back in the first edition. I don't think those texts are very readily available. I think they'll have to be reprinted. I think also that they're extremely valuable because they're aimed at children. And we don't need to discuss how significant an invention is when we start teaching children appropriately. The other thing I would say here is this, that I fear that teachers in Guyana will need to be taught how to teach not only Rodney's text, but any text that is consistent with the representation of the interests of the vast majority of the Guyanese people. Conditions in Guyana have deteriorated. There's been, over the years, an exodus of teachers. I think it has improved marginally, in the very least, in recent years. But Guyanese teachers have become known in Africa, in places like Botswana, for example, throughout the Caribbean and in North America, for the excellence of their product. And this is because the training colleges produce teachers, the university produces teachers, and a lot of them migrate to greener pastures. And those pastures are greener because they offer something more than what is offered in Guyana, which doesn't offer very much to its people.
One small point, if I may. My understanding of it is that those two texts started off as 2 of 6 radio talks that Walter did because he was seeking to document for children the main ethnic sections, if you like, of the Guyanese population, and to do so on a progressive basis for children. So the whole set need to be dug out, edited, and organized for republication. They are not readily available anyway.
Yeah, they will have to be published.
Yeah.
And be readily available. But that, I mean, and you know, I agree with Kimani. The teachers will have to be, there will have to be some kind of instruction for teachers and teaching these books. But the other point I want to make is that, I mean, accompanying this recent decision to allow these books to become part of the curriculum should also have been, probably it is in the decision, but I would like to see history of the Guyanese working people, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, and all the texts, People's Power, No Dictator, Struggle Goes On, Walter and Arnold Rampersad, and all of these things reprinted and be available for the public to purchase, be available in all libraries, in all school libraries, primary, secondary school, community libraries, the University of Guyana libraries, all across the country.
Yeah.
Then we would know that there is a serious attempt to reform the curriculum, to allow these kinds of discourses to take place. It should also be accompanied by funding for the history department of the University of Guyana and the beefing up of the history department of the University of Guyana. How would a country like Guyana, which is unlike most other Caribbean countries, because it is the only country, along with Trinidad to some extent, that was part of the sugar revolution of the 19th century, when the rest of the Caribbean, when sugar was ending in the Caribbean. Guyana was engaging in the sugar revolution, and Guyana became a monocrop. You see, we tend to forget, and Walter reminds us, we tend to forget that Guyana became a monocrop economy as the Caribbean became diversified. And this is why Walter said that when we rethink history, when we understand history, and we go back into history, we would see that Guyana is different from the Caribbean and more like Brazil and other countries in South America, because economically, we are more connected to South America than to the Caribbean. So the importance of these books are so important, but it cannot happen just like that. The University of Guyana History Department is not a proper history department, is not functioning, does not have the resources and the staff. So these things cannot happen in a vacuum.
Also, I would urge that we think about contextualizing the information, perhaps updating it in some ways. We shouldn't allow it to escape our attention that the production of knowledge has moved on from where one left it. And that if we're going to properly locate his work, then some of the new things that have been learned, the newer knowledge, will need to become part of that environment in which the work is located. And I would urge properly updated. To understand what I'm hinting at, perhaps I should say that one of the things that scholarship has got to do is to retake knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge systems that have been destroyed or deleted or partially deleted across the world. And I mentioned ancient Egypt, the study of the Nile Valley, early on, I think before we came on the air. Walter mentions ancient Egypt in his text, but we need a far more explicit understanding of ancient Egypt as part of our carrying forward of Walter's work or any progressive work. And it's not just ancient Egypt in isolation. Ancient Egypt in its proper genetic and organic and sustained contact with the rest of Africa, not in a way that Eurocentric scholarship attempts to disconnect it from living Africa. And these are developments that became far more explicit after the murder of Walter. But we must make certain that his scholarship continues to live and vibrate among us in ways that help to propel our understanding of this world. That's one of the best tributes we could pay to this outstanding scholar.
One more point I want to make, and that is the importance of availability of history of the Guyanese working people cannot be overstated. Because what the history of the Guyanese working people do, it demystifies this history, and it allows East Indians to see that they also participated in the making of Guyana as well as African people. And that, you know, there's this idea that is being floated around that the East Indians who came and were made to work for the wages that the ex-slaves, that the enslaved were paid at the time of apprenticeship, that they saved the sugar industry. And it's a narrative that will be debunked if this history is available for everyone to read.
Thank you very much. Okay, I have a question from our sister Donna Mattis, who's part of our group as well. She said she's wondering, with the emerging role of China as a power and the symbiosis of state capitalism in China with liberal capitalism in the United States, which has seen China exploiting its labor force by making it available to world capital and decimating the global working class. How can we use Rodney's scholarship to address this and take it from the theoretical to the practical against the background of someone who was passionate about the humanization of the working class?
I'll answer it this way, Amanda. You know, I think it was 2009, I was asked by Interpress Service in Brazil, because of the Brazilian incursion in Latin America and the taking over of the use of Brazilian capital to take over land. You know, this area that is called the Cerrado in Brazil, I mean, we have about maybe 15–20% of the Cerrado left. It has all mostly been taken over for the production of corn and soy, specifically for the Chinese. Now, my response was, look, what I would want from the Chinese is for them to be true to their socialism, to their socialist rhetoric. We should not, you know, they're imperialists. Basically, they are imperialists. If they were true to their socialists or socialism, then they would socialize their foreign capital. What I said is, why go into Africa? Why go into Latin America? Why go into these countries and help local capitalists who you're colluding with to take over villages and farms and small people's land, why not funnel that capital to their same small people in order that they can boost their production, and then you can buy the products from them? But they have no interest in that. So they're not different from what the Europeans did in England in the enclosure movement, or what the imperialism has done across time. And so we have to be clear. We have to be clear. State socialism or state capitalism and liberal, all is the same thing. What's the difference between these things? Why are we splitting hairs on these issues? When the Chinese established schools in China so that it can bring the high school kids who are doing well in Africa and instruct them and then send them back to Africa, what is it the Chinese are doing? And we have to be clear on these issues.
At the risk of seeming to contradict you, my good brother,
go ahead.
I want to put up, I want us to think about something. I'm not really contradicting you. I'm just making something, adding to the complexity of the situation. Because one of the things that the Chinese have done in Africa and elsewhere that Europeans have not done or done to that extent is to promote infrastructural development. And I think in our attempts to understand it, we need to include the full complexity of what's happening in China. On the negative side, that's assuming that infrastructural development as articulated by the Chinese in Africa is positive. On the other side, the Chinese have been in places like Ghana where they're associated with environmental degradation on a very large scale. And I think that when we look at China's participation, intervention, call it what you will, in other parts of the world, especially the developing world or the underdeveloped world, there are some of the issues that come out of the practice. Another one is racism. Chinese racism in Africa is something that has been reported upon, and you would have expected that a country that has the history of China and has the ideology that China proclaims would have been more careful in representing itself and having itself represented in parts of the world where racism has been a scourge, racism by Europeans. But we see these things happening in parts of Africa. And I think that that adds to what you're talking about, Wazir. And on the other hand, the promotion of infrastructural development gives us something to wonder about, to ask ourselves, what is the cost of development? Should development have any negative effects? Is there a different kind of development when we have what the Chinese themselves call win-win? You know, what's happening here? What do we do? What is the way forward? I don't think that, I certainly don't have an answer, but we are seeing, even in what appears at first to be a positive development, we're seeing very, very negative issues, outcomes associated with it also. And for some people, the Chinese are just another set of imperialists. I'm a bit hesitant to accept that without reservations.
Point taken, point taken.
Oh, may I make a point or two? Clearly the easy comparison between China as imperialist and genuine capitalism imperialism is an easy one to make. And I don't say that it's content free, but as an African, when I look at our resources, they're not primarily controlled in Beijing, they're primarily in London and Paris and Washington and so on. That's my first point. The second point is that China had a genuine revolution that broke with international imperialism and has enabled them to make a path of their own. Clearly, they're not perfect, and the point about Chinese racism is a very powerful one. So what I think we need to be careful of, and what I'm certainly being careful about, is recognizing that the core problem might not be China. The core problem is actually neocolonialism. The neocolonialist leadership in the Caribbean or in Africa are unable. Walter talks about this in his 1975-76 paper onto the Sixth Pan-African Congress, actually 74 Pan-African Congress. The incompetence, the backwardness, the anti-working people characteristic of our leadership in the so-called third world, Africa, Caribbean. Let's stick to them. They're the ones who are facilitating and benefiting from all of those negative developments that we want to blame on China. And so what the issue raises is not that we join with the West in their racist anti-Chinese ramp, which they're now doing, right? But that we recognize that what Africa and the Caribbean needs is the revolution that China had, which liberates us from capitalism, imperialism, gives us the kind of leadership that we need, and that enables us to analyze what is happening, enables us to work with rather than against our people, and so on. I'm outraged that there are Africans and others who are joining with Western imperialists and pretending to be interested in the Uyghurs. When was the West interested in any Muslim people? And they're only interested in the Uyghur because they can use them against China. One system, one country, two systems was working very well with Hong Kong. The West encouraged an idiotic generation of young people to do what they did 2 years ago. And now they're talking about China depriving Hong Kong of freedom. It's completely idiotic. And on what basis does America or Britain, with their racist incarceration policies, their racist stop and search, their systematic racism, dare to talk about freedom in China, when, right, what I experience as a Black person living in these places is, you know, the systemic racism of them, and I'm not about to join with them in any campaign against China, right? China must be handled by proper African leadership who understand our interests and can deal with foreign forces and arrive at the correct outcome.
I'm very sorry to have to intervene at this point, because I'm really disturbed. If when I make a criticism, or someone makes a criticism of China for their inhumanity and inhuman treatment of the Uyghurs, that somehow we are joining with Western imperialism. All I'm saying is that the Chinese should be true to their socialism. And if they're true to socialism, then they would be humanists. That's all I'm saying.
No, I don't know that the Chinese are not humanist. I know that there's a problem with the Uyghurs. I do not accept the Western representation of it. And I am completely skeptical of people who destroyed 3 or 4 Muslim countries before our very eyes and are presently destroying Palestine, telling me something about being concerned about Muslim people on the edge of China. It's incomprehensible, it's unacceptable, it's foolish, and I'm not going down that road. Now, I don't say that China is above criticism, but I do say that we are watching a move organized, or the whole of the media, government after government in the West, right, are now in this business of putting themselves on some moral plane above China. On what basis?
We're not joining that moral plane, brother. We're not joining that moral plane. Look, I grew up from my childhood, defending the Palestinians, defending the, you're giving solidarity to the African liberation movement. Yeah. And it was hard for me to accept when the ANC government shot 44 mine workers in Africa, in South Africa. So we have to be careful that we need to speak on these issues wherever we are, in defense of humanity, wherever they're exploited, whether it is in China, in Palestine, or in any other parts of the world.
It's right.
I think we need to get
one brief moment. Humanism matters, but what matters in the world is class analysis. What matters fundamentally in the world is class analysis, and that is the basis on which I function. So I'm against the ANC government. The moment that murder happened, we've been out on the street in London year after year. In the first year after the Marikana thing, we were out there every week opposing the government. The issue is neocolonialism and how, if at all, we can manage to get rid of it. Because if we don't, Africa is seriously endangered.
Africa is still seriously endangered.
Yes.
And I didn't have to wait until Marikana happened to realize the nature of the ANC government. I think that when Mandela, for all his fortitude and other good things about him, came out of prison, the kind of reception he received in the Western media should have warned us about what was really happening. I mean, this is a guy who was put in prison because he stood up for freedom. And the same people who claim to represent freedom, praising him to hell and saying that apartheid is finished. But I don't know, perhaps you could help me out, if there's a single blade of grass in Tanzania that has been handed back to the people from whom it was stolen. Has the apartheid economy been reformed in the favor of the majority of those people who've been exploited for all of these years? Now, if these fundamental issues have not been resolved in favor of the people, how could you talk about the end of apartheid? And how could you say that Mandela, in the second coming, is the kind of freedom fighter and exemplar to humanity that the Western press made him out to be? These are serious questions, and we need to keep remembering what Walter Rodney tells and what he fought for: the people, the people, the people, the great majority of the people. And, you know, in our attempts to understand China, and I take the positions of both Wazir and Brother Cecil on this, you know, it's the African people's interest that we have to keep looking at. Yeah. And if the Chinese are allowed to do what they have been doing in Africa, and I do mean those words, I'm not saying that the Chinese are all bad, that all the racism comes from all of them and it represents the government intentions and blah, blah, blah. No, I'm saying that the Chinese, or some Chinese, have been racist in Africa. Whose responsibility is that? Well, you could blame the excuse me, those Chinese, yes, but Africa should have a strong government that is very clear about what its interest is and how they're going to represent that interest. And I'm not seeing that in the current situation. And for me, when we look at, if we want to understand questions of Hong Kong and so on, let us first of all remember what Hong Kong is. Hong Kong was taken away from China by military force by the British.
Yes.
They fought 2 wars to get to sell dope, the right to sell dope to the Chinese. I mean, Walter taught us about history, about understanding history. So how could a pack of vagabonds who are mass murderers actually tell the people of Hong Kong or the world about democracy, about human rights? These are the people who hung all the people, Nehanda, for example, in Zimbabwe, for organizing for freedom. This elder was hung by the British, and it's not a singular occurrence. So we need to be very, very clear that mass murderers, rapists, and other sorts of inhuman people with inhuman practices cannot be our teachers on these issues. They just can't.
One small point on Mandela. I think it's extremely important that we know now, yes, Amanda, very brief, that we know that even though Mandela took to arms struggle, he never wanted any more than one man, one vote. We're not in the presence of a revolutionary when you go back and read what he was saying and what he was saying up until the point of his death. Not a revolutionary. He wasn't for any kind of transformation of South Africa, the economy, beyond one person, one vote. And he says so repeatedly.
Thank you very much. I am going to have to step in. We should have another event on this. You know, the debate around sub-imperialism of Azania and of the ANC in Brazil, China, and Guyana, and you know the debate around the presence of Chinese FDI and cooperation agreements in Venezuela and Caribbean. I think that'd be really interesting, just not right now. So on that note,
all good things coming to an end.
Yes, I do want to make a momentary intervention on the massacre that you just flagged. I actually think we all agree on everything you've been saying about the ANC. I'm going to share my screen. If I can find the slides. Here we go. Okay, and this is just to make an announcement, if I can, that this year, August 16th, 2021 will be the 9th anniversary of the massacre that was just mentioned, the Marikana massacre. Just a reminder, it was the shooting of 34 mine workers by South African police on the orders of the ANC government and at the urging of the British mining company Lonmin. So this is a class relation, a neo-colonial class relation between a British finance and British mining corporation and the local security forces and government. Every year we are outside of the South African Embassy in Trafalgar Square. This year we will be there at 4:30. From 4:30 on Monday, the 16th of August. Several members of AGE are also co-convening this vigil as we do every year. If anyone is interested in participating in this year's event, they can write to Andy Higginbottom, and I'll put his email address in the chat in a moment. But to draw things to a close, I do want to thank everybody, all of our panelists, including some who have had to leave, for their wonderful interventions today. It was truly a pleasure to commemorate with such conversation the legacy of Rodney's work as an historian, building on his relationship with working class peoples in a broad, grounded sense. I'd also like to thank everyone who took the time to spend the last few hours with us, wherever you are in the world. And I do want to offer a few words to close today's event. Exactly a month ago today in Johannesburg, we lost another comrade and working class scholar, or at least originally working class scholar activist, Aziz Chowdhury. This event is dedicated to his memory, as well as to the memory of Dr. Walter Rodney. Aziz's life was dedicated to celebrating the ability of working and oppressed peoples to produce their own histories, their own knowledge, and their own roads to emancipation. So I want to end with a few of Aziz's words on Walter Rodney. This is something that he wrote in a 2015 op-ed to Stabrak News in an article called Learning from the Ground Up, Education for Change, which I've linked on the Age Facebook group. Some individuals achieve extraordinary things, but I believe that social change is driven mainly by ordinary people, organizing, learning, and creating knowledge together, by people consciously and collectively taking steps to bring about change. Walter Rodney's academic and popular education work also reminds us that for action to be informed by a deeper historical understanding of how and why we are in the state we are in, a historical perspective is important. One which also points to future prospects for change. But more than this, what also remains important today is the value that Rodney placed on the political relevance of everyday encounters outside of academia, his respect for the intellectual life and the knowledge created by ordinary people. It is their daily local struggles where people learn, reflect, strategize, and act that can also offer hope and vision for a fairer society and world. Without daily struggles, larger systemic change cannot come about. So with that, I would like to thank everybody for their sincerity and their passion and their knowledge today. And to bring this to a close, we will be putting out the videos, the individual interventions on our channel, but please do keep in touch with us so that you're made aware of when we have yet another event in this nature, probably on China. Okay, go well.
Thank you.